I'm just so excited to be here. I'm in this dream place.
This one comes highly recommended.
Dream place.
What are you doing?
Get out of the car.
Yeah. The girl is still missing.
What's wrong?
I just don't know who I am.
I wonder where you were going.
Mulholland Drive.
Come on, it'll be just like in the movies. We'll pretend to be someone else.
Silencio.
This is all an illusion.
You want to know who you are, don't you?
Where's this going?
Mulholland Drive.
It's been a very strange day.
Getting stranger.
Silencio.
Shama people, and welcome to our 162nd episode of Gold Standard, the Oscars movie podcast, where we travel through time, reviewing the films that earn their gold statue, or standard, if you will, and beyond. I am one of your co-hosts, DJ Nik. And as always, joining me in the Gold Standard Theatre are my two podcasting partners in crime. On one side, the professional nerd herself, Rachel Friend. Hey, Rachel, how are you today?
Pretty good. You know, it's amazing how much confusion sometimes and trouble occurs when blue boxes pop up.
Most certainly. Very well said. And on the other, the Ghostwood girl, Zan Sprouse. Hey, Zan, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I probably shouldn't tell you guys about this nightmare I keep having, though.
If it involves a diner, I think we definitely don't want to hear about
exactly.
it.
I mean, it's a dumpster, and I don't even want to think about it.
I mean, we're from the Midwest, so sketchy diners is, they're a dime a dozen around here.
I guess so. I've never been to a real American diner. We don't have diners in Italy, so my next time in the States, I'm definitely going to a diner. And speaking of diners, ladies, making his return to the podcast, the man who knows all about diners and bringing his film selection to the Gold Standard Theatre today is the one and only Charles Skaggs. Hey, Charles, how are you?
And I think we're all glad that I'm the one and only, right? So, hi, everybody. Welcome back to, I'm so glad to be back in the Gold Standard Theater with you guys. It's just been a lot of fun, and I'm so glad I get to do it again, and I get to talk about a David Lynch film, and I'm talking about a David Lynch film with not just Zan for a change, right? So that's always fun. And I'm so glad we get to talk this one, and I can't wait for this discussion. I'm so excited.
I think it's going to make for a great discussion indeed. You know, Charles, you, of course, bring some fantastic movies to the podcast. Of course, you popped our Fincher cherry, and now you're popping our Lynch cherry. So I guess that's how it is.
Although with Lynch, it's more of a not a cherry stem. I'm just saying.
Very well said.
See what I did there? All right.
You certainly played it very well there, because today, dear listeners, we are reviewing Charles's selection, Mulholland Drive. This was, of course, directed and written by David Lynch, while the score was by Angelo Badalamenti. An estimate, putting today's money adjusted for inflation, this movie cost $28 million to make and made $37 million globally at the box office. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival on May the 16th of 2001 and was then released to the general public as of January of 2002, after having been released throughout the US as of October the 19th of 2001, and has a runtime of roughly 2 hours and 26 minutes. So, Charles, as you are the bringer of today's movie, what are your general impressions and thoughts on this one, and why Mulholland Drive?
Well, one of the reasons I selected this movie, obviously, one was because you guys hadn't discussed a David Lynch film yet, but I was kind of torn between this film and Blue Velvet, but I thought this film would be more appropriate because of the exploration of Hollywood and the kind of shenanigans that go on with films being made. And so I kind of thought it was a little more relevant to a podcast about movies and about Oscars and the Academy Awards and all that. So I thought it was a little more relevant. And I have to admit that there was a particular scene in this movie, which we'll discuss, that I kind of wanted Rachel to experience for the first time. A certain scene as you go behind a certain Winky's diner and see what lurks in the dumpster behind the diner. And Rachel, I hope you appreciated that.
Great.
I did the first time I've seen it, but unfortunately I'd already seen this. So
Oh, okay. Wasn't aware that you had already seen this film.
Yeah, this wasn't a first watch.
Okay.
That is a great segue, though, Rachel, because coming to you, what did you make of Mulholland Drive?
Well, I mean, we'll talk about that character and what they represent, but the kind of the kind of the David Lynch version of the Crispy Master. Yeah. This is, like I said, I've seen that I have seen this before, once before. I will say that, and the first time I watched it, I was well aware of who David Lynch was and that his films are very, you just kind of like, what? You kind of get to the end and you're like, what just happened? And your brain starts going on overdrive trying to put it together. And I definitely felt like that by the end of this the first time. I do have to say I've never watched Twin Peaks. So I have that working against me. So I have seen his Elephant Man though. And that's a really good movie. So, but that's a lot easier to follow because it's based on a true story. But after time and watching more film, just kind of in general, and then going back and looking at this again, if you really want to get, depending on how far into the weeds you want to get, you could spend so much time debating about symbolism and what people, places, things, colors, camera angles, mean. But in general, the overall kind of plot and the major plot points is actually fairly easy to follow once you know is the thing. You really got to have the benefit of it's not something you're really going to figure out while watching it the first time through, but after the fact, hindsight allows you to put the puzzle pieces together. And this is in a way Lynch's kind of homage to the Hollywood system. This idea of fame and Hollywood being the city of dreams and of fame and fortune and being a star, and how really the becoming stepping off the plane in Hollywood and suddenly becoming the next Marilyn Monroe or Brando or whatever is dumb luck. Honestly, you got to be seen by the right person at the right time or make the right connections, and not everyone gets to the point where they have that face and name recognition. And some people are fine with that. We've got some really good like character actors in here who like you recognize their face, but you don't really know their name. But that's a steady paycheck, and some of them they're happy with that because then you don't have the pressure that comes with being the big a big star, which we see that as one person's star rises faster than the other, and what the comes with that, both for the person and the people surrounding them. This is it's a little bit of A Star Is Born. It's a little bit Sunset Boulevard. It's it's a in a way it's almost a cautionary tale. you know but it's told in such a way that it really easily just be pretty girl from no name town America comes to Hollywood to try to make it big, and it doesn't turn out the way she thought it was going to, and it ends in tragedy. Yeah, we've seen that story over and over and over again, but not told in this way. And because it's done in this manner, I think the not necessarily moral, because I don't think, because David Lynch even himself was like, I'm not going to explain anything to you, because, he's like, I want you to interpret it and take it in however you want. So if you get some sort of like morality tale out of it, that's on you, not on him. If you want to look at it that way, but just kind of the story that he's telling, because it's done in this manner, is, I think, it going to stick with you and make you think about it more than something more straightforward.
I definitely agree with you. I think David definitely leaves a lot of reflection when it comes to anything that he has done. And Zan, I know, of course, that like Charles, you're a big fan of The Man from Missoula, Montana. So, and you've seen this probably multiple times. So what are your thoughts on Mulholland Drive?
I love this movie. I say that while Blue Velvet is my favorite David Lynch movie, I think Mulholland Drive is his best movie. I think it is all of the best parts of what David Lynch does as a filmmaker. And Rachel's right. David Lynch is not interested in you deciphering his meaning of what his work is about. David Lynch is all about ideas. That's the important thing to him. And he says that if you have 5 or 6 ideas, you have a movie. And this is a wonderful example of that. And some of it is ideas we've seen before, where just the concept of a seedy underbelly of any place that seems like it is putting on a front, and Hollywood is beautiful California, the dream factory, but there is a seedy underbelly to Hollywood. You could wake up tomorrow and everything's different, that he has explored in Lost Highway, Twin Peaks: The Return, all kinds of things, and just characters that are there to either be entertaining or mysteriously come in and give us exposition, or just to add depth to the universe, just a different flavor than what our main story can be. I'm talking to you, Billy Ray Cyrus. And this is my favorite movie with Billy Ray Cyrus, by the way. But I think this is a linear enough story that I think it has more of a mass appeal than a lot of David Lynch's other movies. There's always something very unsettling about David Lynch movies. And I think with Blue Velvet, Frank Booth, Dennis Hopper's character, was specifically unsettling and off-putting with how horrible and violent and abusive and vulgar he was. And even with something like Lost Highway, there is something so unsettling about that level of spousal abuse and the fear of all of a sudden you wake up and you have no idea why you're in prison as somebody else. But this one I think is a little more relatable for a lot of people. This whole idea of having a dream and getting the shot to try to make that dream come true, but then getting caught up in the reality of the, not just seediness of it, but the dishonesty of it, the insincerity of it, the superficial, not sure who you can believe is telling you the truth. Even with, when she goes and does that audition, just, oh yeah, this is, and when I tell you this, I mean it. It's like, do you though? Like, you can't ever really truly believe, we've all heard this before, when your movie does poorly, you find out who your friends really are. She learns all of this so quickly and learns about obsession. And at the end of it, we sort of see both, or not both, because there are several ways that Betty/Diane could have gone in this. But we see one way where it works out kind of well, and one way where it works out kind of not very well. And so you see all of the aspects of it. And again, you wake up or you open a box or something happens and everything can be different. Everything can change with the turn of a key. And regardless of how it happens, regardless of what powers of the universe make that happen and then turn the couple that you sat next to on the plane into tiny little mouse people, whatever did that is not the point. The point is that somebody had this idea to tell this type of story with these types of aspects. David Lynch movies are like a fruit producing tree. I would say a cherry tree, but that feels a little too on the nose, where there are several branches and several just little gems of deliciousness all over the place. They're all the same fruit and they all kind of go together, but they're all maybe different shapes. One may be sweeter, one's maybe sour, maybe one's not ripe yet. Maybe one's rotten and fell off the tree. We're not sure, but it's all just about the ideas. And I think the way the ideas mesh in this one, how so many different characters and caricatures of tropes of Hollywood characters. We have the gangsters that run everything. We have the asshole egotistical young director. We have the washed up director. We have the up and coming stars. We have the on their way out stars. We have the married for image people. There's so many caricatures of the tropes we've seen in Hollywood in this one. And it's just so entertaining to watch. And it is unsettling on a more even level than I think of a lot of David Lynch's movies are. Yes, we have some jump scares. We have some, what the hell is that? We have some moments where we feel uncomfortable because we feel as an audience invasive or intrusive. But it's just this sort of low hum of unsettled, not disturbed, not put off, but unsettled. And when you have an audience with that feeling and you have the perfect Angelo Badalamenti score going underneath it, that also is very unsettling. That's one of the more unsettling things about this movie, is this unresolved, unsettling low hum of Angelo Badalamenti score. It puts you in that place of exhilaration and unknown that our characters are in, but you're not necessarily afraid, or you don't have to walk this one off, I think, like you do some other movies. There are some terrible things that happen in this movie, but nobody's Frank Booth, and I think everything that David Lynch tries to do as a filmmaker just fires on all cylinders in this movie. I think it's just fantastic.
I 100% agree with you. And to piggyback what you got about what you guys were saying is, yeah, this very much feels like a film that feels less like a film that wants to be solved and more like a film that wants to be experienced. It's almost like, yes, waking from a dream and realizing that the emotional logic of the dream was stronger than its literal logic. What stays with me with this one most is the atmosphere, of desire and illusion and dread, because it begins with this seductive, almost weightless sense that anything might be possible, but gradually that dreamlike beauty starts to feel unstable. Identities blurring, reality seems to fold in on itself, and moments that initially appear romantic or mysterious acquire something much darker in retrospect. And yes, I also love how the film treats Hollywood, not simply as a setting, but as a kind of fantasy machine. It is a place where people can reinvent themselves, where ambition can become indistinguishable from self-deception, and where the promise of becoming someone else can be both intoxicating and devastating. And I think the film seems fascinated by the gap between the life we imagine for ourselves and the life we actually have. And then there's the sound and the imagery. So much of the movie communicates through silence and shadows and empty spaces and strange performances and sudden shifts in tone and that peculiar Lynchian feeling that something is profoundly wrong, even when nothing visibly frightening is happening. And the film can be incredibly beautiful and deeply unsettling in the same breath. For me, the ambiguity is part of the point. Trying to construct one perfectly coherent explanation can almost diminish what makes it powerful. It feels more useful to think of it as an emotional puzzle, maybe a meditation on longing and jealousy and guilt and fantasy and failure and the desperate human tendency to rewrite reality when reality becomes unbearable. So by the end, it does leave you with that strange feeling of having understood something without being able to completely explain what it was. And honestly, I think that's one of its greatest strengths. It's haunting, not because it gives you a mystery to solve, but because it makes you feel the consequences of a dream falling apart. So, David, wherever you are, fantastic job, man. So let's get to our characters on the board, starting with our dual leading ladies and their dual identities. We have latest MCU entrants Naomi Watts as Betty Elms, Diane Selwyn, and Laura Harring as Rita Camilla Rhodes. So Charles, starting with you, what did you make of these two ladies and their dual identities?
Well, obviously these two are very interesting characters on multiple levels, as it turns out. We're kind of introduced as the film starts from Betty's perspective, who, as she arrives in Los Angeles and she's there at the airport, she's talking with this elderly couple that Zan was referring to that we end up seeing later in the film, that she has these hopes of making it big as an actress. And so she's kind of wide-eyed about everything. She's just trying to take this whole, she's come from Ontario, Canada, as it turns out, and she's just blown away by this whole thing. And she is there to stay at her Aunt Ruth's place while Aunt Ruth is away. And she arrives at her apartment building, kind of gets set up with, meets Coco Lenoir, which we'll talk about, Ann Miller's character. And she settles into this apartment, but through events that we see earlier in the film, she encounters a mysterious brunette in the shower, and assumes that woman is a friend of her aunt's. Now, with what the woman that we know later, or it ends up being called Rita after looking at a poster of the film Gilda from 1946. Rita is someone who, at the beginning of this film, we see traveling along Mulholland Drive, where, of course, this film gets its name from. And she's in a car being taken somewhere, and the driver stops and orders her out of the car at gunpoint. But before she can get out of the car gets struck, and there's a car wreck, and which causes her amnesia. She loses her memory. She kind of stumbles her way in a daze all the way down the Hollywood Hills toward Los Angeles. She sees the city lights ahead of her, so she just kind of walks toward those lights, but through the Hollywood Hills. And she ends up in that apartment, and it's that when when Betty comes in and finds her there. These two, at first Betty's a little unsure of this person, but she ends up, and this is what kind of drives this film, is that she ends up trying to help Rita establish, try to find out who she really is or what happened to her, and about, trying to find out more about this mysterious car accident. So it's essentially they're trying to solve the mystery of Rita's identity. And in this film, the theme of identity plays a huge part, because obviously later in the film, we find out that the people that we know as Betty and Rita are in fact two other characters, Diane Selwyn and Camilla Rhodes. And there's the story with Betty and Camilla, or excuse me, Diane and Camilla, is a very tragic one. And the way that we're linked to it is this very intriguing idea that Betty and Rita go into this apartment and they find Diane Selwyn's body there. And through the use of this plot device with this blue mystery box and a mysterious blue key, we end up being transported and especially Camilla is transported, or excuse me, Rita is transported into the real story behind what happened with Diane Selwyn. And so, yeah, it's a lot to kind of, take in and experience, but if you don't really kind of get into it the first time, I definitely recommend, like Rachel did, you watch this film maybe a second or a third time, and maybe things that you didn't appreciate the first go round, you might be able to appreciate in multiple viewings. I think the more subtleties in this, and so we get this tragic story of what happened with Diane, as we find out everything that she went through, that she ended up in love with Camilla Rhodes, but Camilla ends up getting this part in at Diane's expense, and so, and then Camilla ends up involved with the director Adam Kesher, who we'll talk about, but Diane feels rejected and hurt, and she ends up getting a hitman to try to take out Camilla. So in her rage, and ultimately the cops closing in and the despair that she feels ends up costing Diane her life, as she ends up committing suicide over it. And it's just this, for what starts out as, again, and very innocent and idealistic and like, oh, hey, I'm going to Hollywood and I'm going to make it big as an actress, feel good type of setting, ultimately morphs into this very tragic tale of what happened with Diane Selwyn and that doomed romance. So it's just there. I think Naomi Watts and Laura Herring is just, yeah, thank you. They're so good in this, and the chemistry between those two is just stunning to behold, and Lynch milks that for all it's worth. He knows exactly what these actresses can do, and he knows that their present, the screen presence that they have, really it makes this story so enrapturing to watch. And I find their characters fascinating. I find the tale very tragic once we get the revelation, but the way it's told in this kind of mystery box reveal way, I think is very innovative, and it's one of the things I love about this film so much.
Very well said indeed. And Zan, what did you make of our two leading ladies and the parts that they play?
These are great performances, specifically Naomi Watts, because of how much she has to do in this story. And Naomi Watts said once that she thinks of Betty as who Diane wishes she were. And that's a very interesting take on it. And I've always seen it as Betty being the manifestation of dream versus reality, and then reality versus regret. Because when we do find out, and where Charles, you're saying that when we find out what really is going on, sure, that could be really what's going on. I don't know. It's David Lynch. What's real, what's not, I have no idea. But when we get to the end and we hear the story about how she goes to the audition and the director didn't like her very much, and just almost the opposite of what happened. And then we see the bitter and angry and cynical Diane versus the wide-eyed and positive Betty. The dichotomy between the two characters and what they've been through and what's been going on in this story, I think can be, again, a relatable experience to anyone who has either tried to make their dreams come true and it didn't work out, or they tried to make their dreams come true only to find out that this dream is actually a nightmare. It's not what I wanted. It's not how I want it to be. And I think we start to see that when we first start to go along with Betty's journey, where things are just so, political and corrupt and fake. And like I was saying, you can't really trust any nice things about anyone or any bad things about it. You have no idea who's being honest with you. And it has nothing to do with how talented you are It has everything to do with how talented somebody with money who has bought everyone else off thinks you are. And I love how adorable Betty is at the beginning. You know, she's won this dance contest in Ontario that has brought her to Hollywood. And she's never really been that far away from home. She befriends this older couple on the plane, and that adorable moment at the beginning where you think someone has stolen her luggage is just the cab driver. You know, so she's probably obviously heard stories about how Los Angeles is a dangerous town, that kind of thing. And just watching her get so excited and just loving everybody she meets and thinking everybody's so nice. And you know, when you have that moment where she has that incredible audition, she's obviously auditioning for something that's, kind of cheesy, right? The story that James Karen is the director for. And it's weird to me that I love a scene this much and that Chad Everett is the other half of it, because I cannot stand Chad Everett. But we see Betty practicing her lines with Rita, and Betty is very surface level. It doesn't seem like she's given a lot of thought or a lot of depth to this character, and she's just sort of saying the lines in a way that seems like it might sound dramatic. But when she gets to the audition and takes it into such a different place, the audience never really knew that this Betty had this in her. And, everyone is so surprised by her. And then she realizes that she can't necessarily trust anybody. He seems so nice and so sweet. Yeah, no, he's washed up. Everybody in this project, this is a horrible project. It's ridiculous, but you're great, and she really just doesn't quite know what to think about all of that. I love watching her learn that a healthy dose of cynicism is sometimes necessary in this life. I think that's fascinating, because as you can see with what she has in her to bring out this character that she does opposite of Chad Everett, she's, not only is she acting circles around that character, but also Chad Everett. She has this in her. There's way more to her than we see, and there's something about her that I think excitement is what keeps her going. She's a very eye on the prize person. And at around that point, when she first meets Adam Kesher and goes into the audition and sort of is able to see what's going on and see how much is actually going on a movie set and seeing where everything is, she's still fascinated by the mystery that is Rita. She, like Charles was saying, she shows up to her aunt's apartment. Rita just found the one unlocked door when she was running away from something. Rita's such an enigma, because, what is she running from? Where did she come from? How, what is her actual origin story? She's still mysterious, even in our third act, basically. And the only thing we know about her is that she is incredibly captivating, because as an audience, we're captivated by her as well, because what the hell happened on Mulholland Drive? And we never find out. There's nothing in the paper, there's nothing on the news. She never, once we open the box, we think we're going to remember something, and then our timeline changes. This becomes a different timeline. But she's just mostly captivating. And I think their relationship is such an interesting one, because even regardless of what version of these two characters we're seeing, it's very obvious that the Diane character is more invested. The Diane and Betty is more invested than the Rita Camilla character is, because when we first see Rita, she seems as though she has amnesia and she's afraid, but it seems like nothing they're learning about is particularly shocking to her. Even when she says, "I need you to go someplace with me," in the middle of the night, it's not a particularly shocking thing in her mind. And then when we have her as Camille, there's almost an entitlement to her. Like, of course you're going to cast me. Of course the director's going to fall in love with me. Of course you're going to stay in love with me. of course we're going to have this in the two sex scenes we have in this movie with these two characters. Again, there's an eagerness on Betty Diane's part, but there's a let's see what happens next aspect to the Rita character. But with the Camille character, there's almost a resignation, like I'm throwing you this bone kind of thing. There's like almost like an entitlement to her. And it starts to go, their second sex scene starts to go very awry. And again, for David Lynch, these sex scenes are not as uncomfortable as they could be, frankly. But these two characters and how they interact with each other, regardless of who they are, is you have one character who is trying to get something, get somewhere, achieve something, make a dream come true. And the other one just seems seamlessly enigmatic and perfect no matter what she does. And so, you have Betty feeling like, well, maybe I'm helping you, but at the same time, Rita is sort of hurting Betty with how obsessed with her Betty is becoming. Not just her as a person and as a love interest and as a friend, but also just as a concept, as an unsolved mystery, as any Hollywood unsolved mystery, where there's such a distance and such an aloofness from Rita. And the same thing happens with Diane and Camille, but with Diane, it's Diane and Betty are like sort of the Batman and the Joker. It's like one bad experience and you go down the absolute wrong path. You start out good, but then you can go down absolutely terribly. And, once you have the same goals as somebody who is enigmatic, that you are obsessed with, that can lead to ruin. That can lead to you trying to hire really bad hitmen. When we know this because we've seen this hitman before, and he is so inept and just not good at what he does. Just, trying to get rid of what you think is your obstacle. But what the Betty Diane character shows us is that you are your own obstacle, and people around you who are enigmatic or getting things you want that you're not having really kind of have nothing to do with you. There are so many other forces out there. Sometimes it's the mob being led by Angelo Badalamenti and Dan Hedaya. Sometimes it's who knows what, which is Michael J. Anderson. There are just powers out there sometimes in the world that sometimes in the case of Diane, it seems like they work against you. And sometimes in the case of Betty, it seems like they don't just really, they're not working against you, but they're not working for you. And this character shows us that, and shows us the dangers of allowing that obsession to take over. And we could sit here and talk all day about what the blue box means, but at the end of the day, the blue box is empty. And what's in the blue box is what you put into it, and the key that opens the blue box changes depending on who has the blue box. Because as you see, the key changes too. And again, that's another David Lynch thing where all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, wasn't that a different key? That's not the point. The point is that what goes into it, or what comes out of it, is what you've put into it. And that's really at the end of the day. And you can see where Betty or where Diane would have this wistfulness and a feeling of loss of the kind and idealistic person that she was when she got here. I don't want to call her innocent, because there was something in her that was able to do that scene with Chad Everett. And I think that was always in her, and maybe her remembering how she auditioned is probably how she practiced with Rita was probably actually how she auditioned. But when she thinks about it again, she's like, maybe this is what I should have done, and just how sad it is for her to have lost that version of herself, because this is a city that will eat you up and spit you out if you let it. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Adam. But sometimes you don't have to let it. And she's let it happen to her. And sometimes it can seem like things just come naturally for somebody else, say Rita or Camille, because like both Camille's, there's two Camille's in this movie. There's I refer to Laura Herring as the Countess, by the way, because Laura Herring was previously married to the great grandson, I think, of Otto von Bismarck. So she's a countess, or had the countess title for a while. So I refer to her as the Countess. With her, and even with the girl who is, we're seeing the audition that Adam is watching when Betty comes in. This is the girl. Her name is also Camille. There's something behind the scenes pulling the strings for these people, and we don't know what, and we don't know why. And the only thing we do know, based on the accident that Rita was in, and based on what we see of, like I said, Michael J. Anderson, Dan Hedaya, and Angelo Badalamenti, it's not good. Whoever's pulling those strings for you is not good. These are not people you want to owe your life to. So there's so many facets to how Hollywood really is. And what I think is so great about the Betty and Diane character is that, David Lynch is from Montana. He's not from Ontario, but he is from the Midwest. And he is from what I've heard, I never got to meet David Lynch. Everyone describes him as the sweetest man you'll ever hope to meet. And there are ways to not let this city turn you into somebody with a shallow resignation, the way we see Camille and Rita. You can still be who you are. And if you let that go, you are going to have regret. You are going to not be able to live with yourself with that. And I've always wondered how much of David Lynch is in this movie himself, because I sometimes think that the way David Lynch avoided being chewed up and spit out by Hollywood was by being unapologetically David Lynch and just changing the expectation of what filmmaking can be. I especially, he does Eraserhead, and then the guy who made Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein wants to give him money to make a biopic about a tragic historical figure. There's an interesting path there, but by being unapologetically himself, people saw things in him. The right people saw the right things at the right time. And that's another thing that that gets talked about in this movie a lot, is how everything is so intertwined, how her aunt knows this person who knows that person who knows this guy who was married to that person. Remember, David Lynch and Mary Sweeney were married for about 10 minutes around this time. So this whole I'm still working with people I was married to thing, David Lynch and a lot of David Lynch people have done that. Catherine Coulson and Jack Nance were married. It's something he's familiar with. But yeah, I've always sort of wondered how much of that message is don't get obsessed with something besides your own true self. And I think these characters give us that lesson. That's one of the things I take from this movie, is how these characters are, you don't want to be a seemingly vapid, resigned person who allows puppet masters to move you around. But at the same time, you don't want resentment and obsession and regret to rule you either. And somewhere in the middle of these four characters is who you need to be. And I love watching them. And especially, like I said, especially Naomi Watts, I think what she does in this movie is absolutely spectacular.
It most certainly is, and I think it will definitely be a bone of contention when it comes to our If We Were the Academy segment. And Rachel, you being our resident armchair psychologist, what did you make of these four personas?
Yeah, again, it makes a lot more sense once you get to the end and you can look back. A good chunk of this story, the perfectly, bouncy blonde hair, bright white smile, cutesy pink cardigan, stars in her eyes, Betty, coming from small town USA to big old Hollywood, and where she won a dance contest. And suddenly that makes you think that you can just go be a big celebrity somewhere, that she could suddenly be a famous actress. Uh, she's very much going into this with rose-colored glasses on, and this is, and then she meets, Rita, who has been in this awful accident that, the accident ended up saving her because that guy was going to shoot her, and just dump her body on the side of the road right there. So it should be part of the Hollywood Hills forever. And, it just so happens that some kids joyriding out, playing whatever, because that is those roads up there by the Hollywood sign and the hills up there, those are very twisty roads, and there's not a lot of guardrails. So you really don't want to be going around those corners very fast, especially late at night, messing around like those kids were. But it turns out to be a blessing in disguise, because yes, she ends up with amnesia, but she's alive, which comparatively to being dead is better in theory. And they kind of have this, with every step of the way, Betty, she's got these people that she met on this plane that are just, become like surrogate grandparents to her on the flight. And are just going to be like, oh, we're going to look for you, on a poster at some point. And she's all, hey, I've got people in my corner even before I've landed. Go me. And then she thinks her luggage got stolen, but it didn't actually. The guy was putting in the taxi. And then she gets to the apartments, and, Coco's a little, strange, but seemingly nice enough. And, oh, look, dog crap. But, people have dogs, and some people don't clean up after the dogs. So it's like, these just like little things where it's like, oh, this is an unfortunate thing, but it's okay. And then she gets into her aunt's apartment, and that's a nice apartment. Of all things considering. Those are some nice digs. Uh, and she discovers, the woman that we're gonna know as Rita for most of the movie, and she's just like, oh, you must be a friend of my aunt's too. And since Rita's so discombobulated, she doesn't confirm nor deny. So Betty's like, oh, well, I'm not going to be alone in this. It's okay. And then she talks to her aunt, and her aunt's all like, what do you mean there's a strange person in my apartment? I didn't, include anybody else. And she's like, what, really? Oh, that's okay. Everything is like, what? No. Oh, that's okay. It's like, Rita doesn't remember who she is. That's okay. Oh, look, we got a name. Oh, look, it says this apartment place that's not as nice. And, oh, it's locked. And, oh, this and this stranger, this next door neighbor, she switched apartments with this person, with this Diane person. Oh, that's okay. Oh, the doors are locked. That's okay. We found a window. Oh, there's a dead body. Oh, that's okay. It's just this, strange she has an audition that, she kicks ass, but then she doesn't get the part. And then she meets, Adam, and, there might be something there, but no. No, it's very much an idealized, like I was saying at the beginning, it's like this kind of cliche story of the the wannabe actress that shows up in Hollywood and has no idea how Hollywood actually functions. Now, is it as dysfunctional? Your mileage may vary. I think it depends on the studio. I think it also depends on the people in charge and who you're involved with. Because the Hollywood system is just so big and so complex that it's like, there's going to be obviously weirdos and people doing bad, nefarious things all over the place. But she is just so, every time something unexpected turns up, she has to find a way to be like, oh, it's just a little bump on the road, but in the end it's gonna be okay. But then eventually the bumps in the road become bigger and bigger, and she can't deny that it's not turning out the way she thought it was going to. Now she doesn't get a part in Adam's movie, but Rita does. And then, she and Rita develop a relationship, but then it turns out Rita's, also sleeping with the director. Rita is seemingly willing to do the more cliche things that people accuse actresses of doing to move their way through the system. And it gets to the point where this seemingly kind of fairy tale version of the Hollywood experience literally and figuratively falls apart. And we discover that what we've just witnessed is the idealized version of what it turns out it's not Betty, it's Diane, has concocted to try to help her broken psyche, because she has broken. The system has broken her physically and mentally, and she has found herself in a very, very low, dark place, and she realizes that she has made some choices that that she's not coming back from. And it's not a happy Hollywood ending for her or Rita slash Camilla, the quote unquote real Camilla, as opposed to the blonde kind of Barbie doll that everyone keeps referring to as Camilla. That's in Diane's mind, in her, more idealized version of events. She's taken Camilla, the real life Camilla that she knew, and in her fantasy has split her kind of into two people. You have Rita, who is the woman that she in theory fell in love with, and has the relationship with. She is the the physical opposite of everything Diane is. She's dark haired, she's kind of olive skinned, the more sultry voice, more of the the darker, as opposed to Diane, who is your stereotypical blonde haired, blue eyed, perky, traditionally beautiful, kind of Hollywood type. And the faux Camilla, the one that the mob and everybody is trying to convince Adam to cast in his movie, is real Camilla's career, and the career that Betty slash Diane never got. And she can't reconcile the fact that this woman that she fell for and had this relationship with is also kind of her seemingly main competition when it comes to having a career in Hollywood. And she can't reconcile that. And when she it's kind of hard. It's like, because I know how we do this, we usually talk about the ending, but it's like the way that this movie is done, the ending is not, it's like where the movie ends. But that's not necessarily where we get our answers, because we get some of the answers throughout. But Betty slash Diane ultimately decides that, as much as she loves Rita slash Camilla, if since she's gotten the career, she's gotten the role in Adam's movie, she seemingly has this relationship now with Adam, and they're supposedly engaged and all of this stuff, that she's like, well, if I can't have the career and I can't have the girl, then nobody can. And she ultimately hires the incompetent hitman to take her out. But in her fantasy world, the hit is a failure, and she's able to, kind of, you know, leave her guilt. But we find out in reality that the hit was, as competent as the hitman was, it was successful. And she has to live with that guilt. It's like, not only has she lost the girl, not gotten the career, but now she's also essentially guilty of, murder. And, that she ultimately can't handle that and takes herself out of the equation by the end of it. But it's that, again, it's kind of that, if you want to look at it that way, this cautionary tale of Hollywood, maybe not necessarily just Hollywood is just a good backdrop for it, because most people are familiar with the idea of Hollywood, going out to California, Los Angeles, and it's full of stars and people wearing luxury clothing and driving fancy cars and parties and paparazzi and all the stuff that a lot of people assume is what being an actor in Hollywood is like, when it's not really anything like that. And you know Betty's tale, even its more sanitized fantasy version, doesn't end well, because as I was saying, the idea that somebody can just step off a plane and suddenly become the next Meryl Streep or Tom Hanks or whoever, that's, the odds are very stacked. Betty slash Diane was seemingly a big fish in a small pond. Now she's a tiny fish in a very, very, very large pond. And the odds of her getting scooped up by somebody are just very, very slim. And she realizes that early on, that even when luck seems to go your way, there's still just there's no guarantees. in there's no guarantees in life, and especially in this particular industry. So the fact that even her more brightly colored, once she wakes up, literally and figuratively, the cowboy shows up and he's like, time to wake up, and it's no longer the more brightly lit, it's the more darker, grimier version of things. That really how life plays out is a combination of luck and your own choices. And in both versions, she's made choices that have brought her to a point where she needs to face the decisions she's made and where she's ended up and what that means going forward. And ultimately what that means is actually the ending of the movie, so we'll get to that. But this is really Diane's story, and we have to you have to understand that she's a very unreliable narrator with this. And it's not necessarily because she's being like nefarious or anything, it's because this is being told by somebody who has not in a stable place mentally and emotionally, and therefore she can't be a reliable narrator. Everything that she's trying to show us as the audience is colored by everything that happened. And even when she tries to come up with a version that makes more sense, makes her feel better, whatever, it doesn't work, because the real world is still seeping in. We see a lot of these faces in the real world show up as other characters, and we'll talk about a number of them. And how some of them play big parts, and some of them are there more symbolic because they happen to be a face or a name that she comes across when something important is happening. But Camilla slash Rita is ultimately is also a victim of the same system, of fame in Hollywood and everything. But she didn't go into it with the rose-colored glasses on, seemingly. She knew how the sausage was made to a point and was willing to get her hands dirty. Get in there, um, if it meant success. And again, it kind of goes to show that you can either play the game or not play the game, and kind of either way you lose. Ultimately the house always wins, kind of. So, but as we get into talking about some of the characters surrounding them, we'll circle back to both of these ladies, because how everything kind of people cross paths and stuff affects the greater storyline, because this is not, like I said, this is not a straightforward story, but it makes it interesting.
It certainly does, and very well said there, Rachel. And to piggyback off some of the things that you were saying, and of course Charles and Zan were saying, I think the brilliance of these two is that they aren't simply two separate identities. They are almost two emotional versions of the same relationship. And I think that's what makes the film so devastating. Because yes, like you guys were saying, Betty feels like the embodiment of possibility. She's bright and enthusiastic and generous and almost impossibly optimistic. There's something wonderfully sincere about the way she enters Hollywood, believing that talent and kindness and determination might actually be enough. But once we understand Betty as part of Diane's fantasy, that optimism becomes absolutely heartbreaking. Because she's not just an idealized version of Diane herself, she's the version of Diane who believes the world might still give her what she wants. Diane, by contrast, is stripped of that protective fantasy. She is bitter and humiliated and jealous and lonely and increasingly unable to separate what she wishes had happened from what actually happened. And I do think Naomi makes the contrast extraordinary, because Betty and Diane don't feel like two actors giving different performances. They feel like two psychological states. The transformation is almost shocking. And then you've got Rita and Camilla, which I find equally fascinating, because Rita is mysterious. She's vulnerable. She's almost blank in a way that allows Betty to project onto her. She needs Betty. She trusts Betty, and she becomes the perfect object for Betty's affection and fantasy. Rita doesn't have to possess much of an identity, because the fantasy needs her to be someone who can be loved and protected and ultimately possessed. Camilla, of course, as you guys were saying, is completely different. She's charismatic, she's successful, she's desired, and seemingly much more secure in her place within Hollywood. And that makes her relationship with Diane particularly painful, because Diane doesn't simply lose a lover. She feels that she's lost the person, the career, the identity, and even the future she believed should have been hers. And what really gets me is how the two pairs mirror one another, because Betty and Rita are the dream, and Diane and Camilla are the wound underneath it. And the fantasy rearranges the power dynamic so that Diane can temporarily inhabit a world in which she's talented and adored, while Camilla is vulnerable and dependent on her. And I think that's why the dual identities are so much more than a clever narrative device. They're about how memory and fantasy can rewrite people. Because, when we're hurt badly enough, we don't necessarily remember others as they were. We reconstruct them according to what we needed them to be, or according to how we need to understand ourselves. So I think Betty isn't simply Diane before she became Diane, and Rita isn't simply Camilla with amnesia. They're dream versions and emotional distortions. And they're what these people become inside a mind desperately trying to turn rejection into romance, failure into success, and guilt into a story that might somehow be easier to live with. And the really cruel part is that the fantasy works. For a while, it gives Diane exactly the life she wanted. And that, I think, is what makes waking up from it So painful. But fantastic performances from both our actresses. So let's get to our Hollywood industry figures, aka, as I like to call them, the gatekeepers. We have Justin Theroux as Adam Kesher, Ann Miller as Coco Lenoir, Adam's mother, Dan Hedaya as Vincenzo Castigliane, Angelo Badalamenti as Luigi Castigliane, and Monty Montgomery as the cowboy. So, Zan, what did you make of our gatekeepers?
Oh boy, where do I start? I think I'll start with the cowboy specifically and the Dan Hedaya and Angelo Badalamenti, mostly because I want to talk about Angelo Badalamenti. He's so wonderful as a composer, and then here we finally get to see him acting, and just these wonderful little comedic moments of, you know, Americans in Hollywood trying to make decent espresso, and also that concept of how easily in a place that is as shallow as Hollywood is, you can piss somebody off. And no matter how hard you try, and no matter how hard you are wanting to do the right thing, it just takes one little thing to piss somebody off. And the reason I sort of lump these three characters together is because they, you know, the two brothers and the cowboy, they represent not just the fact that there are unknown forces in Hollywood pulling strings from all different aspects, from, you know, your classic mob to the where the hell did this cowboy come from? There are powers that be that have the money or have the influence or have something that are making these decisions, and that a lot of these times these decisions are made seemingly arbitrarily to the filmmakers, you know, Adam of course being the filmmaker, having no idea where it came from, having no idea why, but just feeling this sense of imminent danger. And, you know, because, you know, we've all seen movies, we all know the imminent danger that the mob poses against us. And I do love David Lynch's depictions of mob people. Any sort of gangsters or organized crime, you know, you've got everything from Frank Booth to Jim Belushi in Twin Peaks: The Return. It's just they can be so ridiculous and so over the top. And these guys, like I said, there's the comic relief of the espresso, and aside from that, they're just sitting there being ominous. They're very ominous. Even Michael J. Anderson's character, you know, sitting in this mostly empty room, observing the world from I don't know how, just from a phone. How is this working? And that's part of the mystery of these characters, is that no matter what your dreams in Hollywood are, there's going to be weird shit pulling the strings that you're not going to understand, you're not going to be part of, and that nobody really understands, other than the fact that you need to listen to these people. And the odd thing being that they all kind of have the same goal at the end of the day, that this is the girl. They all want this to be the girl. And we don't know why. We never find out why. It's just that this is the girl. And even with the cowboy, you know, Monty Montgomery is usually is a producer. So, you know, this is not an actor. So I love the fact that there's a producer playing this part, because that's who has to tell the artists and the filmmakers about this kind of stuff. Like, look, there's going to be some guys that come in, and when they show you this girl, I need you to say, this is the girl. And I need you to not ask me questions about it. I just need you to do what they say, because they run this show. And nobody knows why. We just know that we have to deal with them. And somebody has to tell the filmmakers that this is the way it has to be, in a way that lets them know, listen, I can't explain this to you, but you have to understand that this is how it has to be. You will see me once more if you do good, and twice more if you do bad. And I don't want to see this guy again. And I love how Adam is like, the cowboy, where the hell am I supposed to meet him? You know, he's so like, what the hell is all of this? Because it really doesn't make sense. He's trying to make a movie, but there are all of these forces of people who are obviously not filmmakers pulling strings to make something happen the way they want it to happen. And again, with a movie like this that is so, you know, this and Inland Empire are very entrenched in Hollywood and the filmmaking process. But the lens of David Lynch of how arbitrarily ridiculous these kinds of directions are coming from, I think is, at the end of the day, absurdly hilarious. Because, whether or not it's the mob that's going to spit out the espresso, whether or not it's some cowboy that wants to meet you out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night, it doesn't make any sense. Just do. There are reasons why I did not pursue a job in filmmaking. I thought I wanted to as a kid. And there were so many things I learned about the business that made it extremely unappealing to me. And this movie does kind of go into a lot of those. But one of them is, look, I wanted to make this movie. Do you like it or not? If you like it, give me the money. If you don't give me the money. What is this? And this sort of like, somebody wants this girl to be successful. We think about movies like The Godfather, where somebody's mad at Johnny Fontaine because Johnny Fontaine, made hit their most expensive starlet fall in love with him. So now Johnny Fontaine can't get a part, and then the mom has to come in. So we've heard this story before, but David Lynch is really showing us how kind of absurd that is. Again, the absurdity and the negativity and the danger that comes with focusing on your obsession rather than focusing on the good things, essentially, or focusing on the true things of what's going on there. And the idea that we have all these people that want this to be the girl, but we have no freaking idea why, is absurdly hilarious. And so I love these, I love these characters because they play them so perfectly. I mean, Dan Hedaya is a wonderful character actor that we've seen a million times. If you don't think you've seen him, you have, trust me. But I think especially to a lot of American audiences, he's known for comedic stuff. He's known for being Nick Tortelli on Cheers, Carla Tortelli's husband. And just to see him sitting there, he's of course, he's also in The Usual Suspects as well, and Buckaroo Banzai. So there's a lot of things that he's been in. But just to see him sort of sitting there, just looking ominous for no reason, next to Angelo Badalamenti, who has made us fall in love and made our hearts break and made us afraid. And we love his music, especially David Lynch fans who have been watching David Lynch movies since Blue Velvet. That's who's been doing music. There's so many things that go against these two guys being the ominous guys, but here they are. And it just hammers home that it makes no freaking sense. And that commentary, I think, is so funny. Adam is, again, when I think about this movie through the lens of David Lynch writing these characters and directing these characters, I feel like Adam is sort of the cautionary tale of directors, because he sort of seemed to fall into every category of stereotypical Hollywood early success. He's young. He's married to a pretty woman that obviously hates him, that you sort of wonder, how did you guys even get together? How did this even happen? If you're just going to go off the pool boy, AKA Billy Ray Cyrus, he has this house that just sort of seems like every other Hollywood house you've ever seen. And he's so driven by his ego. He's such an unpleasant person, driven by his ego. But then at the same time, in a second, it can all be taken away. One meeting where he says, I'm not going to let these guys tell me what to do. And all of a sudden his bank accounts are frozen. He's staying in this, covered in pink paint because he's put paint all over his wife's jewelry, which is hilarious. And at the end of the day, in order to get back to where he was, he has to play the game in a way that's even worse than if he had just said, this is the girl at the beginning, and that sort of cautionary tale of not knowing that this is a game and thinking that because you're a director, you can direct the game, and then realizing, no, you're just who people choose to direct the visual part of the process that is the game. And how he, once he realizes he has to go back after he's done all of the stuff, like, after he's covered in pink paint, staying in the shitty hotel, married to a woman he doesn't like that doesn't like him, even though he obviously has somebody that works for him that's in love with him, busting up somebody's car, almost losing his movie anyway. He just goes right back to where he started, and now he has to play the game, but now he's sort of sold his soul. And so it's like you have to learn how to play the game before you try to destroy the game, because then you have to go back. Then you have to go back to being the pawn, and that's not where you want to be. But I also love the dichotomy of Adam, where you can tell, even though he is, with his sunglasses indoors and his leather jacket and his black clothing and all of that stuff, you can tell that deep down what he wants to do is be a filmmaker, and make art and make good things. And that's why this is also incredibly frustrating for him. And you can also see that there's a false bill of goods that somebody probably sold him, that your ego is how you're going to muscle your way into things, that ego equals confidence, and that's not necessarily the case either. And I think I love how Justin Theroux plays this character, because I so just don't like him. I really don't like him. But then even when we see him at the end making who knows if it's another good movie or bad movie. I don't know what these movies are going to be. They don't look particularly interesting to me. And then we meet his mother, who is yet again kind of another puppet master, just a couple of steps shy of a little bit of a Manchurian Candidate kind of situation. And you can see that the kind of person he's become is somebody who can't actually be the original person that his ego tried to portray he was earlier in the film, that he just is another puppet in this process, no matter how much he tried to pretend and bluster his way through not being that. And it just sort of proves the point that behind most blowhards is a tiny, small person that can't actually do anything on their own. And it's like, I can't stand that character, but I love watching him, and I love watching how he moves through and how he reacts, and especially the way he and Naomi Watts look at each other on the soundstage, when he sort of turns around and over his shoulder and looks at her, and they have that moment of truth with each other, and then a realization that this is not the town for truth. This is not where truth is going to happen. Back to his mother, I absolutely adore the Coco character. Both Coco and Adam's mother represent something, but Coco especially. The fact that she's played by Ann Miller is fantastic, because this was Ann Miller's first movie since 1976. And it was also subsequently her last movie. But her first movie was, the first movie she's credited as Life of the Party. But she was in Anne of Green Gables in 1934. She's in, this is our second Ann Miller movie. She's in You Can't Take It With You. And she's also in Kiss Me Kate. She is old Hollywood, and she's everything about old Hollywood that is fascinating and wonderful and mysterious and also ridiculous. Ann Miller was born in 1923. What's she doing with jet black hair in 2001? And that's a thing that you see a lot. And you guys have been to comic conventions with some older people from Hollywood, where it's either jet black or wigs or way too red hair. I don't care how much plastic surgery you get. I know I saw you in a movie in the 30s, or just even, I don't care what your hair color is. I know that I saw you in a movie that was old when I was a child. Like, you're not fooling anybody. And that concept of old Hollywood still trying to hold on to this glamour is kind of hilarious. And even though she is the landlord, she does sort of, and David Lynch does this. The Twin Peaks character Carl Rod is kind of like this as well. This landlord that knows everyone and knows everything and isn't judging. Even Lee Grant's character as let's cover Lee Grant in a veil and make her say that something's really ominous going to happen. I don't know what that's all about. But Coco's like, you need to go back home and just knock this off. Coco knows what's going on and knows everybody and just understands it. And I think Coco represents that concept in Hollywood, that this is a system that you just have to understand. It's no one person's going to change it. No one person is going to break it. You just have to understand this world of ridiculous, mysterious elegance and glamour that has a seedy underbelly, but a beautiful face that it shows the world. And I think this is one of the best casting decisions you could make, to have old Hollywood portraying old Hollywood, because there's still that mentality. When Rachel was talking about the idea of you get off the plane and now you're famous, we've talked about that so many times on this podcast. That's the Broadway melody also. I mean, Rachel mentioned A Star is Born. It's 100% A Star is Born. It's Singing in the Rain. It's all of those movies that made you think you just go to Hollywood and somebody falls in your car and you drive them to Sunset and Camden, and then all of a sudden you're famous. This movie plays on that trope in in the most absurdly unreal, realistic way. And having Ann Miller there to help guide us through it, either as she is the mother of this whole operation. She's like everybody's mother. If you're here, you're okay people, because I know people. And that's another thing about Hollywood too. It's all about knowing people and having that edge, or having that something, or, you have to, not only do you have to be able to read people and understand people, but you have to be people that people want to read and understand. And Coco's so perfect for that, and just her ability to be able to sniff out what's not right, but also what's not right in a way that's okay. It's like, all right, something's going on with you and this girl, but I'm going to trust you because your aunt trusts you and you seem like a nice kid. All of those things where you have to sort of put all of these things together and weigh each absurdity and which absurdity outweighs the other one, and go from there. And it's adorable. And I think I love seeing, we have now done my two favorite Ann Miller movies. I love You Can't Take It With You, and I love this movie, and I love that she's in both. And you can't get much more old Hollywood than somebody who worked with the frickin' Marx Brothers, So yeah, all of these characters, when you put them together, all represent not just the system and how the system has been through the ages, but also how there are so many intangible things that Hollywood runs on and relies on, and you can't define them. And David Lynch shows us that you can just sort of portray them. And at the end of the day, we are watching a product of this absurdity. And we are watching someone who has found a way to make the absurdity work for him. Even if the director in our movie can't quite do that in the way that he seems like he would like to, he also shows you what it's like to sell your soul for that. What kinds of movies are you going to be doing, and who are you going to have to be working with, and are you going to be a famous Hollywood director and still have your mom kind of picking out your girlfriends for you? So there's a lot to unpack with our puppet masters here, and I've said this before with David Lynch, and I'll say it forever, that just think what you think when you watch a David Lynch movie. Let it happen to you. You experience David Lynch movies. You don't necessarily watch and analyze them. You feel them, you experience them. And because you're going to think something different tomorrow when you watch it again. Like every time you watch this movie, you focus on something different. Like I remember the first time I watched this movie, all I could say was, yeah, you're going to really like Billy Ray Cyrus, and you're not going to understand why. There are just things that you feel when you watch this movie, and when you think about this movie and what it's depicting and where it came from. Just let it sit in your head for a while. Just let it marinate, and just feel and experience that. Even if it doesn't particularly make sense, nothing in Hollywood does. So just let this one flow over you.
I think that's a great point, Zan. I guess, as my mother often said, it's not what you know, but who you know, I suppose. So as often I like to share my mother's pearls of wisdom. There's another one for you. And Rachel, what did you make of our puppet masters, as Zan said, or our gatekeepers?
Yeah, it's because the thing is we we find out that the what we're seeing with a good chunk of them is Diane's fantasy version of how everything played out, and obviously she was not there for everything, so her we kind of have to infer that her mind is the best way that it can kind of make sense of why things did not play out the way she thought when she stepped off that plane is because of the other, the powers that be, the people behind the string, the scenes that control the purse strings and make all the decisions, the idea that Hollywood will give out roles to people because of name recognition or whatever instead of talent. Granted, there are some well-known actors out there that have the talent to back it up, but then there are some where it's like, yeah, you just have the name recognition, but like you couldn't have picked somebody else for this part. Especially when I mean, this is a very small, representation of this, but you could easily extrapolate it even to now, but really since the Hollywood started giving roles to recognizable names of sometimes very talented, sometimes okay, but they're good enough actors and actresses, usually white and not bothering to maybe take the chance on an unknown in a role that really should have been cast with somebody who maybe was a person of color or maybe somebody of another marginalized community, maybe actually cast a trans person in a trans role, actually have a disabled person play a disabled part. So, I think this is kind of Diane's mind's kind of way of explaining why she did not get the success that she thought she was going to get in Hollywood. Is it's these unknown puppet masters, and if you're talking about people strong arming or making decisions for other people, who better than Italian mobsters? Yeah, I think she's also, we kind of are under the, you kind of have to work under the assumption that Diane is just so naive about everything that she's plopping in kind of stereotypes into certain for certain parts to tell this story. And it's like, why not the mob? I mean, it's as good as anything else. You know, the seemingly the mob had a lot of pull, in places like Vegas and Reno and stuff. Why not Hollywood? You know, um, so sure. The fact that like they're so like again because she's I mean Diane is a character. Diane slash Betty is from Canada, so she's not even necessarily American, so I guess that makes her even more removed of what like America is like, not just Hollywood. So she's made these Italian mobsters that are like pulling the strings, and they're like so Italian that there's no way that they can get good espresso in the United States. you know. so, so it's like if you can't even get a good espresso, what makes you think that you're gonna make them happy by choosing your own lead actress? No, just he's going to spit you out on a napkin just like that espresso if you don't do what they tell you, essentially. Um, and then you have the cowboy, which again is kind of if you think of like the golden age of Hollywood, westerns were a big part of early Hollywood, in its heyday. You think of people like John Wayne, who, made an entire career out of playing in cowboys. I mean, again, this character is supposed to be Canadian. What's more American than a cowboy? And what do cowboys sometimes do? They give advice. they'll give sage advice, sit around the campfire, they'll tell you stories and about, how things are done and the best way, to live life and to whatever, it's not my cup of tea. John Wayne can suck it. So, but you get what I'm saying. Oh, so you get this character of the cowboy, and he doesn't get a lot of screen time, but when he does, he is there for important reasons because that's kind of what cowboys do is they just kind of pop in and save the day or whatever and dispense some sage advice and then move on, right off into the sunset, never to be seen again until they stumble across the next town or whatever. Um, so, um, and he's one you kind of have to keep an eye on because he tells Adam, if you do well, you'll see me one more time. If you don't, you'll see me two more times. And for Adam, he only sees him one more time. But when it comes to Diane and Camilla, we see him two more times, even if they don't. I mean, obviously he wakes Diane up. So, but we see him, uh, where he doesn't interact with anybody, but he is seen. So there's a lot of, and I think this is one of those things where, not just for making sense of it for me, watching this again after the fact, after letting it sit for a while helps, but because you have, in some cases, some of these actors playing more than one part, you've got Coco in fantasy Hollywood, and then you've got Adam's mother in the real world. I am terrible with remembering faces. It's not anything, nefarious or whatever. It's just I for whatever reason, my brain does not do well when I see a face. If it pops up again, even if it's apparently in the same program, that I will not necessarily put two and two together that I've seen this face before. Charles can attest to this when we were talking about Deep Breath, the fact that it was like, Capaldi's doctor's like, well, I've seen this face before, and we're all, all the Whovians are like, yeah, it's Fires of Pompeii, and I'm like, I don't know, you know. Have we seen this face before? I don't remember. And it's the same thing with this. Um, and we have a few more uh characters actually that where we see their face more than once that I'm like, oh yeah, because some of them they're blinking, you miss them, but they're important. Even if they don't necessarily interact with any of the characters, none of these faces show up for no good reason. Lynch had, even though Lynch was kind of famous, supposedly famously didn't necessarily know how this movie was going to end, even as they started production. He's like, I don't know, we're going to figure it out as we go along. We're going to find out together. That, he does not do any, he does not have these people play these multiple roles and show up in certain places in certain situations for no good reason. It's every face, every name is done on purpose. And the team up of Adam and his mother is interesting, considering you've got, we see Adam's mother as Coco, kind of as this landlady, and she's nice enough, the way she is dressed and the severity of how tightly slicked back her hair is and how that is not a natural shade of black, especially on a woman her age. It's like, it's a bit Norma Desmond, like she's trying to keep, keep up appearances, even though everybody's like, you're not fooling anybody, we know you're much older than you probably want people to think you are. And she tries to be warm and welcome and friendly to Betty, and then she sees the dog poop and she threatens to You know, she threatens the owner of the dog, which does she necessarily need to threaten the dog too? Maybe not necessarily, but you know, as a landlord, you do kind of expect your residents, if you allow them to have pets, to clean up after them. Um, so, uh, but then you know, in reality, she is Adam's mother, but she plays a similar role where she is kind of the person with the power. You know, you've got all of these people, and then you've got Adam, who's the director, who seemingly should be the one that calls the shots as far as casting and everything, but yet he is seemingly powerless to the giant conglomerate that is the Hollywood machine. And you know, it's not he's not just getting it from the mob, he's not just getting it from the strange cowboy, he's getting it from his own mother. Which probably made him an easy target for the mob, you know, actually. It's like it probably seems like his mom has probably pushed him around most of his life, so it made, yeah, it's like, you know, he's not going to grow a pair at this point, you know. They're like, we can make him do whatever. But then he meets Rita, and he sees an opportunity to do, you know, he, as much as it seems like he and Betty kind of have a moment when she walks onto the soundstage and he sees her across the way, and they're, you know, looking at each other and maybe kind of having this meet cute, you know, instant attraction type thing. He can't, because he's being strong-armed into hiring fake Camilla, blonde Camilla. And even though Betty looks, you know, fits as for looks as you're concerned, she checks the boxes. He's like, well, I can't have that. But then here comes Rita, and nobody's objecting to him casting her for the other female part. And it's like, well, you know, if nobody's objecting to that, then there's probably no objection if I decide to get, you know, have a little fun in the process. And again, Rita understands how the game is played. And she, you know, even though she's supposedly in a relationship with Betty, she's all like, you know, if this gets me the part, and you know, why not? You know, uh, I get the part. We both have a little fun, and but it ends up snowballing, and kind of having this domino effect, um, and you know, ultimately, you know, we kind of really don't know what happened. You know, if the movie gets finished before everything goes down with the hitman and everything, you know, does Adam at the very least get his movie made? We don't know. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, just because a movie gets cast and it gets shot and all the pieces and parts are in place and stuff is happening, does not mean that the movie's going to get finished. And even then, even the movie can get finished and never see the light of day. We've seen that countless number of times where we know movies have been shot, and you know, they may need editing and maybe, you know, sound and a score put in, but you know, as far as like principal photography, it's done, it's in the can, and yet we're never going to see it. It's just going to sit somewhere and never see the light of day. Or it could be released and end up being a big old flop. Again, that's the nature of Hollywood. It's not a guarantee. No, even with people in power supposedly pulling the strings, that doesn't mean they actually know what they're doing. Or in some cases they do. You know, as we have learned with a certain other superhero universe film that is now sitting on a shelf presumably somewhere, that, you know, just because it was made, sometimes just taking the tax write-off is better for the checkbook than releasing it and paying advertising and then not have it make its money back in theaters. And maybe that's why these mobsters, don't really care whether they're casting the right person for the role, because they know that they can manipulate things in a way that they're going to walk away with money in their pockets regardless. And that kind of, again, kind of men behind the curtain, faceless string pullers. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there are some there. Follow the money. You will find people like that within the system, but it's not it. The way that Diane's mind has formed this theory is, I think, grossly oversimplified. But I think that also comes from her naivete about how the real world actually works.
That is a fantastic theory right there, Rachel, for sure. And I guess yes, there are a few movies sitting on the shelf, which hopefully at some point we'll see. I think speaking of superheroes, I think of a certain Batgirl movie, which was never released, which was prepared, but such is life. And Charles, what did you make of our gatekeepers, puppet masters, string pullers, you name it?
Well, they're a very interesting bunch, aren't they? We kind of the first scene where we're introduced to Adam Kesher, where he attends this meeting downtown and he meets the Castellani brothers. And if you're a David Lynch fan, you're immediately going, Angelo Badalamenti, because Lynch and Angelo are just such wonderful collaborators. And it's just a lot of fun to see him in a little bit of just basically a cameo role, but it's a fun cameo where he gets to do this little comedic bit where he hates this espresso that he's been given and slowly spits it out into a napkin. And just the absurdity of the scene is very David Lynch and balances against this underlying threatening tone of the meeting, because these presumed gangsters, thugs, whatever you want to call them, they produce a headshot of this actress named Camilla Rhodes, who isn't the Camilla Rhodes that we meet later, played by Laura Herring. It's Camilla Rhodes, whose face is Melissa George, who, if you're an Alias fan or if you saw her on Star Trek Discovery, among others, that you recognize her. And they want Adam to cast her as the lead in his new film. And it's here where you start off being sympathetic for Adam, I think, because yes, he comes in, he's very much the artiste by the way he dresses, the way he carries himself, and the way that he's kind of clueless about why are we having this meeting? I gotta get this movie made. And you kind of feel a little sympathy because you see these rather sinister forces trying to push him in a direction that he doesn't want to go in. And his frustration with him, and I think this is probably kind of symbolic of what some of the frustrations that Lynch has felt over the years with various studio heads and whatnot, investors, what have you. So I think that it's kind of Lynch kind of getting some of that out through Adam in a lot of ways. So he goes out, he takes his frustrations out by just beating the shit out of the windshield of their limousine. And he feels like, okay, it's his way of this is the only way I feel like I can control this situation that I'm in. He's taking his frustrations out. And ultimately, though, that act has consequences, as we find out. So he arrives home and, he drives off in his Porsche. He thinks that's going to be the end of it. He comes home. His wife is cheating on him with Gene the Pool Man, played by Billy Ray Cyrus. And in a very funny way, Billy Ray Cyrus is just kicking back and sitting there, very cash about the whole thing. He's just laying back. He's got his arms behind his head. He's like, dude, what are you so worked up about? And his wife Lorraine is just angry, tells him to get out, and it's like, okay, you're the one cheating on me, but you want me to get out of the house. So Adam is just spiraling into this really, really bad day at this point. He gets mad, he throws paint over Lorraine's jewelry, and then he gets into a little rough and tumble with Jean and gets thrown out of his own house. He takes it in stride and then ends up going out to this after finding out that I guess he goes to this low rent motel, and then it's there that he finds out from his assistant that the bankers have called and told him that he's broke. So he gets really he's befuddled by this. He's like, okay, well, how did that happen? I should have money, shouldn't I? And Cookie has been told, presumably by these mysterious forces, that Adam, if he wants to get this resolved, he has to go meet with this guy called the Cowboy. And Adam is just apoplectic by this point. He's like, a cowboy? What the hell is going on here? And she tells him, okay, you have to go all the way up to the top of this hill in Beechwood Canyon. There's going to be a corral up there, and that's where you got to meet with him. And seeing at this point, I think Adam becomes exasperated by this point. And I think part of the problem that you start off being sympathetic with Adam, that kind of turns a little bit because, well, basically Adam's kind of a dick. And it's his attitude that presents a problem, especially when he goes to meet the Cowboy, because the Cowboy is essentially the spokesperson for whatever shadowy forces there are controlling things. And the Cowboy kind of lays it out for him and says, okay, there's going to be this girl there, Camilla Rhodes, and you have to cast her, the one from the photo. And if you do good, you will only see me one more time. If you do bad, you will see me 2 more times, whatever that means. And it's a warning to him, like, look, you better, if you want your life back, you have to go along with this. So Adam is on the soundstage, and where they're auditioning actresses for this role in this, what we find out is called the Sylvia North story. And it's here that we kind of see Melissa George's Camilla Rhodes lip syncing to what Zane and I took on as our theme song for Drunk Cinema, Linda Scott's I've Told Every Little Star. And that lip syncing kind of plays into something else we'll talk about later a little bit. But Adam has to reluctantly, as one of their representatives, shows up at the soundstage. Adam has to tell that representative, this is the girl. And you can see he's bitter about it. He doesn't want to do it. And after he says that, that's when he sees Naomi Watts' Betty. And you feel this connection like and that kind of hits home. And we pick up later in the film, after we start getting the reveal of what's going on, the real story with Diane Selwyn, that Adam is hosting this party at his home. And he makes this little joke, well, my wife got the pool, man, but I got the pool. And meaning you got to keep the house, presumably. And we see Laura Herring's Camilla cozying up to Adam, being very, very flirtatious. And poor Diane is seeing this. And Adam doesn't really care about Diane. He's caught up in the moment. They're kind of giggling and laughing about this engagement that they're going to announce. And you see that regardless of how hurt Diane is over losing this role in Adam's production, he doesn't care, because now he's caught up in this little fling that he's having with Camilla, and now she's becoming his wife, because to, I think, Rachel's point, or Zan's point, that he has sold out. Now he's basically realized, well, I kind of like the finer things in life. I like my career. So I'm your yes man now. and he's been bought and paid for. And I think it's kind of evocative of how maybe artists that want to create something wonderful, they're all about the work, but then they get kind of sucked into the system and end up ultimately becoming part of it. So there's a good little message there, I think, and that's why I really you end up despising Adam by the end of this film, but I think you can kind of understand his motives for why he did what he did, because essentially, if they're powerful enough to cut you out of your finances, your career, and this is all you've known, this is all you can do with your life, you either have the choice to either completely abandon what you love, or you have to kind of go along with it. And that's unfortunately how the system works, is that the system applies this pressure, and artists have to end up compromising themselves over it. So it's very, when you juxtapose all of this against these issues with identity and the tragedy of Diane and Camilla's romance, I just find it fascinating. And as for Coco, Adam's mother, she starts off being so wonderful and helpful to Betty, like, hey, I know all the right people. And then ultimately, by the end of the film, as we get the revelation that she's Adam's mother, you have to wonder, what part did she play ultimately in Diane's downfall? That's my take.
That is a great point there, Charles. And to piggyback of what you guys were saying is, what I find fascinating about these figures is that they make Hollywood, like you guys were saying, feel less like a conventional industry and more like, yes, a strange, almost mythological system of power, because they aren't all powerful in the same way, and some are almost absurdly eccentric, but together they do create the sense that there is always somebody above you deciding who gets to enter the room, who gets to stay, and who gets discarded, very much like the music industry as well. I'll start with Adam. I mean, he is probably the most interesting of the group, because despite being a director, he isn't really free, because he appears to have authority, but that authority evaporates the moment someone more powerful enters the picture. His refusal to cast a particular actress seems like a professional decision, yet suddenly he's being pressured and humiliated and effectively reminded that the creative process isn't entirely his to control. And I love the irony there. Even someone who is supposedly a gatekeeper discovers that he is also being kept behind a gate. When it comes to his mother, Coco, she occupies, I think, a completely different position, because she's warm and maternal and almost reassuring, which makes her relationship to the rest of the film rather interesting, because she represents a more welcoming side of Hollywood. The idea of community and belonging. But because we later understand how distorted the surrounding reality is, even her kindness takes on a slightly dreamlike quality. She's almost a comforting figure inside an environment that otherwise feels deeply hostile. When it comes to our Castiglione brothers, they're where the film really starts leaning into absurdity, like you guys were saying. They're exaggerated, they're theatrical, they're almost caricatured versions of mysterious industry power. Yet I don't think David is simply making fun of Hollywood. Their ridiculousness actually makes them more intimidating. The famous espresso scene is funny, but I think underneath the comedy is something rather sinister. This is power behaving as though ordinary rules don't apply to it. And then there's the cowboy, who might be the most purely symbolic of them all, because he feels like a lesson of an ordinary Hollywood figure and more like an embodiment of authority itself. Because his dialogue has that strange quality of sounding simple while carrying enormous weight. He doesn't need to shout or threaten anyone. He simply arrives, and he says what needs to be said and leaves you with the impression that some invisible hierarchy has just asserted itself. I especially like that David never gave us a neat explanation of exactly who these people are or how much power they generally possess. And that's important, I think, because Hollywood in the film operates almost like a dream about Hollywood. The industry becomes a place of whispered decisions and mysterious phone calls and strange meetings and inexplicable demands, and people who seem to know something that everyone else doesn't. And then I think there's a wonderful contradiction running through all of this. Hollywood promises individual expression and creativity and fame and reinvention, but the film keeps showing us structures of control. Someone is always choosing, someone is always being chosen, and someone is always being rejected. And that's why I see these figures as I was saying, as the film's gatekeepers, but also as manifestations of the system Diane is struggling against, as Rachel was pointing out, because they represent the terrifying possibility that success isn't simply about talent or desire. There are forces operating above and beyond the individual. And sometimes you don't even understand the rules of the game until you've already lost. And I think the film makes those forces funny and grotesque and mysterious and frightening all at once. Somehow that feels more truthful to Hollywood, I think, than a straightforward depiction of powerful executives that ever could. So brilliant portrayals, I think, of the Hollywood system. So let's round off our characters with our surreal manifestations, or as I like to call them, the nightmare and the guilt. We have Bonnie Aarons as the bum outside Winky's, Patrick Fischler as Dan, Michael Cook as Herb, Jean Bates as Irene, Dan Birnbaum as Irene's companion, and of course, Richard Green as the magician. So Rachel, starting with you, what did you make of our surreal manifestations?
Yeah. That's one way of putting it. Um the a number of these people are that's exactly what they are manifestations. I think Dan is one of the exceptions where he is a face that we see in the quote unquote, in the real world when Diane is at Winky's hiring the hitman. Dan is standing there at the register, presuming, paying for his food or coffee or whatever. And, they exchange glances and you kind of have to wonder, it's like, okay, how much did he hear? Is there somebody out there that knows at least some of what she was doing and what she was planning? So for him to then appear in, kind of her fantasy dream version of things, he is paranoid. It's the best way to put it. And considering the how they encountered each other in the real world, I kind of understand. I think he's a manifestation of her paranoia that, that somebody may have overheard her essentially planning somebody's murder. And the guy he's talking to, or Herb, is her conscience, being like, well, face it, if you just face it, then you'll know one way or another. If you face up to what you did, then you'll know, whether you actually have anything to be worried about or not. And so they take that walk outside, and you get that jump scare. And there's again interpretation. Some people think that Dan dies from the scare, and some people are like, oh, he's just fell down unconscious, it spooked him out cold. But then the bum, or crispy master, if that's how you want to look it up, is kind of, it's a woman in the makeup. The character gets referred kind of as a he. But I think it's left in, kind of ambiguous in a way, and kind of undefinable, whether it's male or female, age, whatever. Because it's not necessarily human. What it is just this embodiment of just all of the bad that Diane is kind of carrying around with her. It's the shame of not being successful, not having the success career wise. It's the jealousy of Camilla's success. It's the betrayal of Camilla, seemingly leaving her behind and going into this relationship with Adam to the point where they're, supposedly engaged to be married, and yet at the same time she's kissing other women right there in front of her, uh which Adam does not seem to care about. If that's not cliche, I don't know what is. um it's the guilt of wanting Camilla dead. It's the guilt of Camilla, when she gets the key from the hitman, that's his calling card. That's his way of saying, the job was successful. Move on. That she's also got the guilt that she, she not only wanted somebody dead, but now that person is dead. She's got somebody's death on her hands. It's it's just everything. It's just all the nasty bad stuff put together and then made anthropomorphized into this kind of creature. And that's why it's so undefinable, because it isn't it isn't one thing. It's a mixture. And you know Dan faced it, and obviously he did not take it well. Even if he's out cold, well, he'll maybe wake up eventually, which if it ends up that if you're under the interpretation that it kind of scares him to death and he just plops down dead there, that's a bit of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to Diane, that ultimately facing everything is ultimately going to lead to her death. And it's comparatively to our elderly couple, that Betty seemingly met on the plane, although we also see them in the montage, the jitterbug contest montage, for a split second their faces appear, which is probably where she got the faces from. They are, because they're an older couple, what you would expect from a pair like them. We could kind of presume that, even though the other guy, the guy that Irene is traveling with, we never get his name. Can I presume that maybe that's probably her husband? We kind of have to make some exception, and some assumptions. That they, you kind of paint them with kind of your stereotypical older couple brush, that they have probably been together for a very long time. So they're the manifestation of a long, presumably happy, romantic, loving relationship, companionship with someone for a long time. They're traveling, they're having fun, they've done the hard work of living life, and now they're getting to enjoy the fruits of their labors, being able to go off to sunny California and have fun and ride in a limo. Like, presumably they're probably from, if they were on the same flight together the entire time, they probably are from a similar area in Canada, like Betty, and also probably come from, a small town. So it's like, oh, look, we're going to go out to California and ride in a limousine. Oh, won't our friends at home be jealous? Wait till we tell the grandkids, and, and the fact that, Irene is just so friendly and kind and so supportive of Betty and her dreams as they're walking out of, out of the airport. Um, but even early on, you could tell there's, if you pay attention, because it's maybe one of those things where if you're not really paying attention to the sound and what you're seeing on the screen, you may not realize that the voices are dubbed, I guess is the best way to put it, which it has a very fake sound to it, which is kind of your first clue that this story that we're about to see unfold of Betty in Hollywood is not what it appears to be. There's something fake about it. And once we get to kind of our climax with the box, and we kind of end up back in the real world, and we get our final kind of breakdown of everything. They pop up again as just these tiny little, just these tiny little menacing, you know, faces that are just, it's like they don't have to be big and grotesque like the bum, to be scary. What, it's like, these, what them as an older couple representative, because it was so fake, can't stand up to scrutiny and therefore shrinks. It's lost all of its substance. And you know, uh, it's just another aspect of what Betty slash Diane thought. She thought that she, could put in the work and get the payoff that comes with that, and she thought she found romance, and that didn't pay off. And she found out that people aren't as kind. So that people are, there are people out there that just want nothing but to screw you over and are willing to use you to pursue their own desires and meet their own goals. um and the fact that Lynch uses an elderly, I mean, they're right in the limo and their big grins and her Irene slapping the guy in the knee. Like, it's so creepy, yet at the same time, it's like, I can so see my Chauncey and I doing something very just be like riding in the back of a limo, just being like, look at us, aren't we fancy? Riding in the back of a limo.
Well, if Rachel, if you guys ever get to do that, I definitely want a picture, because I guess then that would be very Mulholland Drive. But that is fantastic. I love that imagery indeed. Any thoughts on our magician?
I mean, I think of all of kind of our manifestations, the magician is very on the nose with it being a magician, because what do magicians do? They make their living fooling people on what they think they're seeing, on making people question the reality. It's about illusion. It's about being, diverting attention. It's about showmanship. It's all about the pomp and the flash and everything, so that people can't see the trickery behind it. That's very on the nose. I mean, when they get to the Club Silencio, I mean, they're literally told everything here is an illusion. Everything's recorded. It's not real. And yet people sit down and are entertained by it anyway. If you've ever seen a magician, in perform in real life, even the most even me, somebody who's extremely logical and understands that, it is an act, it's a show. What I think I'm seeing is not actually is not what I'm actually seeing. It's all about, forcing you to pay attention, watch what the left hand is doing so you can't see what the right hand, so you're not paying attention to what the right hand is doing. And it's like, even on a logical level, it's like, I understand that I'm being tricked, that what I'm experiencing is fake, it's not real. You're still captivated by it because it's so entertaining. There's just something about the idea of suspending disbelief, even just for a little bit, I think is very human, just because the human experience can be so hard sometimes. That sometimes wanting to suspend your disbelief and just be entertained for a little bit is not the worst thing in the world. It's when it gets to the point where you lose track of what is actually real and what is not. And it's there at the club with the performers, like the magician, with the singers and all, all the stuff you'd expect, with going to a club or a venue like that where you're going to see and experience those kinds of things. There's a reason that that's where things really start to fall apart. And again, Lynch does not do anything on accident. And, we're told that things are fake. And, we've got a magician where we know what what they do is fake. And yet it doesn't matter. And that's why even when things start to fall apart, Betty, literally starts having convulsions. She's almost physically manifesting her mental state finally cracking, and the wall that she's built between her fantasy world and the real world is starting to crack. She's still holding on to it. It's not, once the blue box shows up, then it's like, okay, well, the barn doors are open, the horses have ran out, there's no going back now. But it's that last moments of, no, I want the fantasy, I want the, I want the flash and the fun and the entertainment and the joy that comes with it, and she can't hold onto it. She's getting to that point of no return where everything is just coming to a head. And that's is going to eventually culminate in the actual ending of the movie.
Well said indeed. And Charles, I guess Silencio no hay banda. What did you make of our surreal manifestations?
Well, one of the things that I love most about David Lynch projects, like such as this film or Twin Peaks, is that Lynch, in exploring and showcasing a very dreamlike state in his storytelling, he finds a way to kind of weave in little teases of possible supernatural influences. And you kind of see that here. You saw that a little bit earlier in the film, that with the, the cowboy, because the cowboy to me seems like he has a kind of a supernatural element to him in a lot of ways. But with the Winkies bum behind the dumpster, that sequence where Dan and Herb are sitting down and Dan's trying to tell Herb about this dream that he had involving a evil entity, and that was behind the restaurant, behind the diner. And Herb says, okay, well, let's just go check it out. And they go back there, and Lynch shows this, takes this sequence, and he draws it out, builds the tension as you start to approach the, what's behind the diner, and gives you that sharp jump scare with the bum popping out, causing poor Dan to either faint or have a heart attack or what have you. But he collapses. And that bum, by the end of this movie, gets brought back in a very kind of supernatural way, where you see the bum having, there's a little brief sequence where you see the the bum, the creature, what have you, holding a box identical to the one in Diane Selwyn's dream. And so that kind of makes you wonder, is the bum kind of representative of perhaps fate, where Dan early in the movie was talking about a dream, and then ultimately he was fated to experience that fear, and where you have Diane going through what she did, ultimately being fated to kill herself. So it has a very supernatural vibe to me, at least, where you kind of wonder, okay, is this creature, was it orchestrating everything all along? So I like that little aspect to it, that kind of that gives you room to think about it and interpret it in a lot of different ways. You can interpret it as, oh, it was a dream, oh, it was something, like, again, supernatural, or it was just all an illusion. And that's something that plays into when we shift to Club Silencio, where the magician is the MC first starts talking about, in different languages, that everything's an illusion. We have Rebecca Del Rio, who's a phenomenal vocalist, coming out on stage. She lip syncs this beautifully haunting Spanish version of Roy Orbison's Crying, and that just will break your heart. And if you want more on Rebecca Del Rio, check out Twin Peaks: The Return, where she does this phenomenal rendition of No Stars. So Nick has that to look forward to when he gets to Twin Peaks: The Return. But these characters in the Club Silencio sequence, they also kind of embody, I think, a little bit of a supernatural aspect. The magician, is he just a stage magician? Is he just a performer? Or is there something more going on? Is there a more otherworldly element to this that perhaps Diane is experiencing? And like, perhaps she's in a version of hell, and you could interpret it that way, where she's reliving everything leading up to the horrible thing that she did, and the guilt and fear over that ultimately costing her own life. So perhaps she's trapped in this little bit of a hell loop. And Lynch gets to use this Club Silencio sequence where, you have performers start to sing, and then Rebecca Del Rio collapses to the stage floor. She has to be escorted out, but her song keeps playing. It's all lip sync. It's all fake. And so this is, I think, a metaphor that what you're experiencing may not be real, and what you're seeing, the story, may not be real, but it's open to interpretation. And that's what I think it embodies a lot of Lynch's work, is that, and I think Zan talked about this particularly, that it's not up to you to define, to try to analyze and figure out what Lynch is trying to say. Lynch just wants you to feel something. Lynch just wants you to experience it. And it's all done with mirrors, basically. And so it's a very theatrical and a very evocative way that this message is being presented. And I just find that very fascinating. So when we get to so as far as Irene and her companion, as Nick liked to call it, the elderly couple, they also seem kind of like a possible supernatural element to them. So where they're these figures that Betty is talking with on the plane, they seem very benign, very friendly, but then once they get in their limousine, they have these exaggerated expressions and smiles that could be kind of, almost very sinister. And so, again, is there some supernatural element working behind the scenes here? And you don't know, because, well, one, it's a David Lynch film. It's up to interpretation. But I think it's something that, as a creative work, I like that it gives you these possible ways to interpret a film. And I think as an artist, I think that's one of the things that, you're not going to, what I like about Lynch is that he's not willing to just clearly defines something. He leaves it up to the viewer. So if you want to interpret it as a supernatural way, great. If you don't, that's great too. And but speaking for myself, I think that's a very interesting way you could go about and kind of connect these characters, whether these dark forces, however you want to describe them, are orchestrating events. And as we find out through the most of this, the poor Diane and Adam and Camilla are the ones being caught up in all this, possibly for their own amusement, if you want to look at it that way. Just something to consider, I think.
And that's a great take, Charles. I absolutely love that. And Zan, I of course have manifested my love for returning back to metal. And of course, I guess Nightmare and the Guilt sounds like a very prog metal album title, I guess. But what did you make of our surreal manifestations?
Well, I'll start with them from in order of appearance. And, we have Dan and Herb, and I think what they represent is no matter how much you talk about your dreams or your fears, you have to go after them. And it kind of doesn't matter what anybody else has to say about it, because you have to be the one that does it. And if someone forces you into it, it's not going to go well. And also, we say dreams are nightmares, but nightmares are dreams. Your dreams can go either way. And if you're not ready for either, it's going to end badly. And if you're going to face your fears, facing your fears, it gets worse before it gets better. And I think that's what we have with our bum scare behind the dumpster, which makes me jump every time I see it. I've seen this movie enough times. I know exactly when it's coming. Doesn't matter. It still gets to me. And if someone is making you force your fears or making you making you go after your dreams in one way or another, when you're not ready for it, if you're not ready for it, it's not going to work. And that is extremely evident in this situation. And then when it comes to Irene and her obviously husband, careful who you trust, I think sometimes is what that is, because I feel like they represent a positivity that isn't real. And all of what I was talking about before about in Hollywood, where you'll have somebody, trash talking somebody else and then saying, "Oh, but not you. You're great." Just their whole, like, "I'll be looking for your name and credits," and, giving them giving her all of the accolades and everything. But then you see them in their limo, just with those really disturbing fake smiles plastered on their faces. These aren't, whether or not they're real people is not the point. The point is that everything they said to her was not from a place of truth. There's no authenticity to these people. And therefore, maybe they're in the perfect place for that. What seems more Los Angeles than driving around in a limo smiling, whether you mean it or not. And when it comes to the magician, not only is he telling you, he reminds me a little bit of Joel Grey's MC, because he seems very, with his brightly colored suit and his weird, beat poetry way of introducing the act. He seems very sinister in a lot of ways, because who goes to a magic show in the middle of the night? What in the Torchwood Night Circus people is that? And he's also there to not only remind you that what you're about to see isn't real, but it's all been done before. It's recorded. We have heard this all before. And when you put all of those things together, your dreams are your dreams, whether they're your nightmares or not, whether they're your nice dreams or your nightmares. And they're not real unless you go for them, and you have to go for them yourself. You can't be forced into it, and you can't be given a false sense of confidence or a false sense of hope. And the only real sense of confidence you have is in the fact that whatever you try and fail to do, someone's already done it before. And it's not going to be the end of you unless you can't face it and you make the wrong choices and you do the wrong things. And that's where the guilt comes in. The guilt is always going to be there, lurking behind the dumpster, crawling under your door as tiny little mouse people, or as is the case with Rebecca Del Rio, just because she passes out doesn't mean the music stops playing. It all still goes on with you or not when you set things, when things are set in motion the wrong way, either by you or by somebody else. It's all going to go on without you. And there's a fear to that, but there's also a comfort to that. You know, there's a part of you that will feel very insignificant when you think about how the world will continue with or without you. But at the same time, the world will continue with or without you. So what you're doing has an impact on you and your world, but not on the bigger world. So do the best you can, you know, make the right choices the first time. You know, don't live in the regret, because it's just going to keep happening. And the same things you're going to see the same people and hear the same songs, no matter what path you choose. So think about that, and think about who you put your most stake in. You know, is it you or is it strangers you met on the plane? You know, what matters is you, and you have to do what you have to do when you're ready to do it.
Very well said indeed. I 100% agree with you, Zan. And you know what? What I love about these figures is that they feel like they've slipped into the film from somewhere beneath the story, because they aren't really there to advance the plot in any conventional sense. They exist to give shape to the fear, the guilt, and the psychological collapse underneath everything else. I think the bum is obviously the most striking. There's something almost unfairly frightening about the image, because the figure isn't presented like a traditional monster. There's no elaborate mythology, there's no explanation, there's no obvious threat. It's simply this horrifying presence emerging from behind the diner, and somehow that makes it worse. Because the film takes an ordinary place, an ordinary conversation, and suddenly gives us an image that feels like pure nightmare. And I think the bum works especially well because of what happens around the dumpster. The horror has been anticipated before it is actually seen. We hear the fear in the story first, and when the figure finally appears, it almost feels like the physical embodiment of something that's been buried and is now forcing its way into a consciousness. That's why I see the bum as the nightmare. It's the image that the mind cannot successfully contain. Everything can be romanticized, rearranged, and turned into fantasy, but eventually something horrifying leaks through. To your point, Zan. Dan, meanwhile, is much more interesting to me as the guilt, because his conversation about the strange dream at Winky's is deceptively simple, because he describes seeing something behind the restaurant, and when he finally sees it, the horror of the image seems to cause him to collapse. What's fascinating, I think, is that the dream is essentially predicting the film itself. He's describing a reality that doesn't make sense, but somehow feels terrifyingly true. And then we have Herb, who grounds that scene in ordinary reality. He's basically the person accompanying Dan into the nightmare, someone who doesn't share the same psychological burden. And I think that contrast matters. Dan is overwhelmed by something that Herb can't fully comprehend. And Irene and her companion have a different function again. Their presence feels almost like the aftermath of the nightmare rather than the nightmare itself. They appear ordinary, but there's something unsettling about their sudden awareness of what has happened. So the film, I think, gives them an almost supernatural quality without ever explicitly making them supernatural. And I particularly like how Irene becomes connected to that final movement toward the truth. She doesn't need long explanation or elaborate dialogue. Her expression and movement are enough to make the world feel as though it has suddenly become aware that something terrible has happened. And that's really what unites all of these figures, at least for me. They're fragments of conscience. And I think the film's fantasy can create Betty, Rita, romance, success, mystery, and possibility, but it can't completely erase what happened underneath. The nightmare keeps returning. The guilt keeps finding cracks in the fantasy. And that's why I think these characters feel so strange compared with everyone else. Because the Hollywood figures belong to the external world of power and control, Betty and Rita belong to the dream. But these figures feel as though they belong to the space between the dream and reality. They are the moments when the subconscious stops whispering and starts screaming. And I think David was brilliant enough not to explain them away. He lets them remain disturbing and irrational and almost impossible to categorize. Because guilt, like you were saying, Zan, rarely arrives in a neat, logical form. Sometimes it comes as an image you can't forget, a dream you can't explain, or a face that appears for only a few seconds and somehow stays with you long after the film ends. And that is what I think makes the Winky sequence so unforgettable to me. It's not merely frightening, it's the moment when the film quietly tells us that beneath all the glamour and the fantasy and the mystery, there is something horrible waiting to be remembered. When it comes to the magician, he is fascinating because he doesn't feel like another supernatural figure in the conventional sense. He feels like the personification of the film's central mechanism, illusion. His famous declaration that the event's not real, while simultaneously insisting that they are happening, captures the strange contract the film makes with us. If the bum is the nightmare that breaks through the fantasy, the magician is almost the architect of the fantasy itself, because he introduces the idea that what we're seeing can be both artificial and emotionally real. The performance is an illusion, but the emotions produced by the illusion aren't necessarily false. And I think that's essentially what Diane's dream is doing. Her mind creates this alternate reality, but the feelings inside that reality are genuine. Love and desire and humiliation and jealousy and fear and eventually guilt. And I also love how the magician's presence strips away our expectation that we're going to receive a conventional explanation. Instead of giving us answers, he basically tells us that the machinery of illusion is already operating. The blue box, the key, the stage, the voice, the music, everything becomes part of this ritual of transformation. I think the magician is the missing piece because he reminds us that this film isn't merely about escaping reality. It's about the seductive power of creating another reality altogether, and how eventually that creation begins to collapse under the weight of what it's trying to hide. And that makes him a perfect companion to the bum, because I think the magician creates the illusion, the bum waits underneath it all. One gives us the dream, the other represents what the dream cannot permanently conceal. And that makes, I think, this group work beautifully as a psychological progression. Dan's nightmare anticipates the horror, the magician establishes the rules of illusion, the bum embodies the terrifying thing beneath the illusion, and Irene and her companion seem to belong to the final movement when the fantasy can no longer maintain itself. And so I think the magician ultimately reminds us that this film isn't merely about escaping reality. It's about the seductive power of creating another reality altogether, and how eventually that creation begins to collapse under the weight of what it's trying to hide. Fantastic performances, of course, and I love, being a fan of the supernatural, I love these performances. So let's get to how our movie ended. Of course, the bum opens the blue box, releasing a tiny version of Irene and her companion, and they, of course, the same pair who accompanied Betty upon her arrival in Los Angeles. Back in the present, we have a traumatized Diane who stares at the blue key on her coffee table. Terrorized by hallucinations of the elderly couple, she flees to her bedroom and shoots herself, dying in the same position as the earlier corpse that we saw. And as the room fills with gun smoke, Betty and Rita are shown smiling at each other, and at Club Silencio, a blue-haired woman whispers, Silencio. So, Charles, what did you make of her ending?
As a ending, I think, well, it wraps up in a way that you definitely expect a David Lynch film to. That you don't get a clear-cut ending. you are kind of left in a very interpretational state. You to put it simply, you kind of wonder what you just watched, and you kind of take that in. And as the credits roll, you're just kind of rolling these images and everything that you experienced over in your head. So with Diane's story, it comes to a very tragic end. And we get the explanation, unless again, that's an illusion as well, that Diane killed herself and because she couldn't face the guilt over what she had done to Camilla. And it's a very tragic ending, but it's also it kind of brings everything full circle in that way. When as soon as we see that when we cut to Club Silencio, we get this woman who we'd only seen in the background during the scene with the magician, but when the camera pans up to the opera box or whatever you call it up there, you see her kind of almost orchestrating this, not really orchestrating, but just kind of announcing to everyone that what Diane experienced has come to an end. There's nothing but silence. Death has fallen, and times the death with the end of this movie. So therefore, Diane's life is over. This dream is over, and now it's time to say goodbye. So again, a kind of a very powerful ending, in my opinion. The imagery is stunning to me, and it just really just kind of puts the nice little cherry on top of the sundae for me watching this movie.
Or cherries in a pie, I guess, if you're of the Twin Peaks disposition, indeed. And Zan, what did you make of her ending?
Yeah, this ending is very tragic because all of our scary, unexplainable stuff comes back at the end of everything for Diane. And we wind up back at the Club Silencio, which feels to me, by the end of this movie, it feels to me like a sort of mental nerve center, because you're driven there for some reason out of everything that's going on in this movie. We have to go to this theater at like 2 a.m. and go see this and go hear this and go understand what happens. And when we get there, we can open our purse and there's the blue box. And there's just something about it being the center of everything and being sort of the nerve center of the dream that this was. And like Charles was saying, it's time to wake up. This dream is over. Silencio. And we're done. Like Rachel said, we're done watching this story. But because we're in the theater where we've been told that this is a recording, has it happened before? Is it a loop? When are other instruments going to come in? All of the, you have that moment where he's telling you, here's the saxophone, and then here's the trumpet, and all of these other instruments come in. It's like, okay, we're in the theater again. What's the next show? What instruments and what characters and what song are we going to sing next? And that, like Charles said, that's for us to decide. That's for us to leave up to that's for the audience to make that decision for themselves. And David Lynch has let us do that. It is unfortunate that we have lost our protagonist, but again, let's not forget that we're also telling a story about a place that can eat you up and spit you out. And also, when we think about it, just when we think about the ordinary things that go through this movie, just all of the other aspects of it, the poor woman who's selling vitamins over the phone who happens to get shot by our hapless assassin, the woman who traded apartments with Diane Selwyn, just all of these things. There's just so many things about this movie and about David Lynch in general, that life is just full of weird shit that just comes at you all the time. Life is not a linear thing. Just weird things happen on a day-to-day basis. And they can become ideas and they can walk right past you. It doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, also life kind of chews you up and spits you out. So it's sad that Betty and Diane's story is over, but Diane almost becomes Betty's own cautionary tale, and we as an audience need to make out of that what we will. And for the two of them, it's Silencio, and for us as an audience, it's Silencio because the movie's over. But also, the 9:30 show is completely different than the 7:30 show. What's next in the theater?
That is a great point indeed. And Rachel, what did you make of our ending?
I mean, the ending is such like after everything, it's just kind of this cacophony of lights and sounds and peeps and faces popping in and out and stuff. It's just this kind of whirlwind, because Diane has completely cracked. All the walls or whatever, mental walls that she tried to build to protect herself from reality have come crashing down, and the weight of that is just overwhelming to her, and it becomes too much, and the only way she can turn it off, the only way that it's going to stop is for her to end herself. It's a tragic ending, and unfortunately it's an ending that we have seen before in Hollywood by some big, some notable names, people that for whatever reason found themselves in a spiral of probably, there's no way you could say it's this thing. This is what caused Marilyn to OD, or this is what caused, Elvis to die, or this is what caused, take your pick. Even, more recently, this is what caused Matthew Perry to die. It's always a combination of things, and even in Diane's case, it's a combination of things. But it became too much, and she needed a way to make it stop, and that was the option that she took. But for some others, it may be alcohol, it may be drugs, and all of those things. Those have they can have compounding consequences that can be unforeseen at the time. Hindsight is always 2020. But for Diane, it was the lack of career, the loss of Camilla, the humiliation, everything. It just the guilt, the shame, and the blue-haired woman at the very end, saying, essentially silence. It's quiet because now the movie is over for us, the viewer. The story is over. No more. Move on. The end. But it's also, in a way, it's also for Diane. She needed to find silence, and that's how she found it. So it's not just an ending for us watching the story play out, but it's also Diane's ending, not only of her own life, but also finally probably finding some quiet in her own mind and her emotions.
That is a great sentiment. And, and to piggyback off of that, I do think the ending is devastating precisely because it finally collapses the boundary between the fantasy and the reality we've been watching. The blue box opening is the moment when the dream essentially runs out of places to hide. Our tiny elderly couple emerging from it is especially cruel because they begin as symbols of possibility and encouragement. They arrived you with the promise of a new life and almost like a cheerful embodiment of the optimism surrounding Hollywood. And by the end, that same optimism has become monstrous because they return now as not as guides into a dream, but as figures of judgment. And then we see the blue key sitting there. And suddenly all the earlier mystery surrounding the key in the box becomes emotionally clear. The fantasy wasn't just an elaborate adventure. It was a psychological construction. And the key is connected to the terrible reality that the fantasy has been trying to escape. And the hallucinations of our elderly couple chasing Diane, I think, is one of the moments that hurts the most for me, because they feel like the return of everything she has been trying to suppress: failure and shame and jealousy and guilt and the knowledge of what she's done. And the people who once represented the possibility of becoming someone are now almost like the embodiments of her conscience. And then the suicide is horrifying because the film has already shown us a distorted version of that death earlier. The circle closes. The corpse that initially seemed like a mystery turns out to have been a distorted glimpse of the ending itself. And that, I think, is one of David's cruelest tricks. The beginning was already containing the end. We simply didn't have the context to understand that. And then comes that extraordinary transition back into Betty and Rita smiling at each other. I don't read that smile as a simple happy ending. It's much sadder than that. You know, for one final moment, the fantasy survives. The relationship survives. The idealized version of everything survives. Diane, I think, can still imagine the world in which love is uncomplicated and everything has worked out, but we now understand what we're looking at. And I think that's what makes the final Silencio so powerful. You know, Club Silencio has already taught us that what we're hearing and seeing doesn't necessarily have to be produced by what appears to be producing it. You know, a voice can continue after the singer disappears. Music can exist without an orchestra. Performance can feel completely real, even when it's revealed to be an illusion. So yeah, when our blue-haired woman whispers Silencio, I don't think she's simply telling us the show is over. I think she's telling us, like you guys were saying, the dream is over. The silence becomes death, but it also becomes the end of storytelling, the end of fantasy, the end of Diane's ability to keep rewriting what happened. There's nothing left to transform, nothing left to romanticize, nothing left to hide behind. And I love that David didn't give us a conventional final explanation. He gave us an emotional one. The blue box closes the dream, the key leads back to reality, the elderly couple brings their guilt back, and the gun ends the life. And I think Silencio leaves us sitting in the aftermath. For me, that's why the ending is so haunting. The mystery is ultimately less important than the emotional truth underneath it, because we spent the entire film trying to understand what was real, but by the end we realized that the fantasy was real in a different sense. It was a desperate emotional reality created by someone who could no longer tolerate the actual one. And that final silence feels almost merciless. There's no redemption. There's no reconciliation. There's no miraculous return to the dream. There's just silence. And somehow, after 2 hours of dreams and nightmares and Hollywood fantasies and shifting identities and music and performances and fractured realities, silence is the most devastating thing that David could have given us. Good job, my friend. So let's get to if we were the Academy segment. Of course, David Lynch was nominated for Best Director at the 74th Academy Awards, but he lost to Ron Howard for A Beautiful Mind, which also took Best Picture, along with 2 other awards, taking home 4 statues in total, alongside The Fellowship of the Ring, the first chapter of The Lord of the Rings, which was the film with most nominations, 13. So, Rachel, starting with you, should this film have won the Oscar it was nominated for? Why do you think it didn't? And should it have been nominated in other categories?
Oof. Well, I mean, anybody that's been listening to this podcast for a while knows how much I adore the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So it's really hard for me to, take anything away from it. It's really, when you look at it, I mean, it's, because this is not the, obviously we're talking about the Best Picture winner, but we've circled the drain of the early 2000s quite a bit. And there's a reason that the first two parts of The Lord of the Rings did not win Best Pictures, because they knew it was a trilogy, and odds are that Return of the King was going to walk away with all the big ones, including Best Picture. So setting that aside, I find it interesting that the movie that did win Best Picture this year is also kind of surreal and told by a narrator that can't be completely trusted, is unreliable. It's just, I guess maybe the compared to A Beautiful Mind, this was just a step too far in the surreal, mind bendy kind of storytelling. Because at least with A Beautiful Mind, it was still telling a linear story. It's just occasionally it diverted into, Nash's mind, where things got a little, kerfuffled, because of his illness. Um, as opposed to this, where, it's not. I mean, it is kind of linear, but not really. It's not as straightforward. Um, A Beautiful Mind is also based on, the life of an actual person, which Hollywood loves. They love biopics. Despite how surreal sometimes some biopics can get. I hate to use the word, but I could just see, especially some of the more maybe traditional uptight fuddy-duddies in Hollywood, looking at this movie and just thinking it's just too weird. It's just too different for them. And they don't like that. Every now and then, movies like this get some recognition. As you were saying, Nick, I mean, it premiered at what, Cannes, and it won, Lynch won Best Director at Cannes for this. So, but Cannes also is a bit more open to more non-traditional filmmaking and film. Um, but it's just the Academy. They're still just so stuck in their ways. They were stuck in their ways then. They're still kind of stuck in their ways now. But at the same time, it at least it got some recognition. And granted, it would take another 20 plus years, but having a movie like this at least get some recognition gives leaves an opening for eventually something like Everything Everywhere All at Once to win, Best Picture. Because, again, it's a fairly straightforward story when you get down to the basics, but it's told in a very unique and interesting and different way that is not the Academy's cup of tea by any means. So it's just it's not anything against David Lynch. It's just it's Lynch against the end. It's almost like the movie itself. It is David Lynch against the Hollywood industrial complex. In this case, it's the Academy, and they are very stuck in their ways as far as what they give recognition to.
Very well put indeed, Rachel and Charles. I know you've been roaming your hands together like a Time Lord, waiting for the next adventure in space and time. So, what do you think when it came to with the Academy? You think David should have walked away with his gold statue, and why do you think he didn't? And should Mulholland Drive have been nominated for any other categories?
Interestingly, I don't think that David Lynch should have won Best Director for this film, because he was up against Peter Jackson for Lord of the Rings. Do I think that Lynch should have won over Ron Howard, A Beautiful Mind? I think so. But I think Peter Jackson had the more stronger achievement. I think that, as far as I'm concerned, Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, Fellowship of the Ring is the best of the trilogy, in my opinion. I think it was his strongest movie. I think that's the movie he should have won the Academy Award for, but that wasn't the case because they wanted to. They basically. I think the Academy was kind of forced into giving him the Academy Award for Return of the King because he had had two successful movies, didn't win an Oscar, and then they ended up giving. They had to acknowledge it somehow, so they did that with the final film. Even though I think the first film is superior to the final film. That's my opinion. As far as other categories, I think that it should have at least gotten a Best Picture nomination instead of a film like In the Bedroom, perhaps, because if you look at the two films, what is the more memorable film? What is the more singular achievement in the film of cinematic filmmaking? Now that's obviously very subjective, but I think Lynch brings a stronger argument in that film, in my opinion. As far as Naomi Watts, I think she should have been nominated for Best Actress instead of Renee Zellweger, of all people. If you compare what Naomi Watts does in this movie to Bridget Jones's Diary, and you don't give Naomi Watts at least a nomination for that, I think there's something wrong with you, personally. And then lastly, I will say that Angelo Badalamenti should have at least got a nomination for Best Score. I think that his work is very haunting, and I love the fact that, and especially in a lot of scenes, in the beginning of this movie, he has a certain theme for the Mulholland Drive opening sequence where we're driving along at night in the car. And then when the film kind of comes full circle, when we go back to Mulholland Drive, he uses that same music, and it's very evocative. And I think it's a great example of just how Badalamenti's music helps sell this film. So I probably would have given it a nomination over, say, Randy Newman for Monsters, Inc., in my opinion. So that's my take.
Which is totally fair, of course. And Zan, I know how much you love the Newman family indeed. And do you think that Mr. Lynch should have walked away with his Oscar and should it have been nominated in any other categories? And why do you think it wasn't?
I definitely do. I feel like the Academy has never known what to do with David Lynch. You know, David Lynch was nominated for an Oscar 4 times, 3 times for director, 1 for adapted screenplay. And it's almost like the Academy is that person you work with who the next day after Twin Peaks aired, they kind of want to talk about it. And it's like, they're like, I know I'm supposed to like this, but I don't know why. It's like people keep telling me it's good, but I don't know why. And I feel like the Academy is kind of like that. Like, we know David Lynch is really good, but we don't know why. We don't know what to do with it. And especially with this one, I feel like this being David Lynch's masterpiece. And the Academy eventually figured out that they just need to give him a Lifetime Achievement Award. You know, that's David Lynch's Oscar, as one of the honorary Oscars. But I do think this is his masterpiece, and I do think I would have given this. And these are all really good directors who are up for Best Director. Ron Howard, Ridley Scott, Robert Altman, Peter Jackson, all really, really good directors. Are these their best movies? Not necessarily. Is it David Lynch's best movie? In my opinion, yes, it is. That's, you know, I have a hard time, and I'll just get this out of the way. I have a hard time seeing The Lord of the Rings as 3 movies because I don't watch it as 3 movies. It's one of those where it's like, okay, it's a rainy Saturday. Here's what we're doing, you know, or even if it's like on TNT, it's like, well, Fellowship's on. Let's clear the next 8 hours of our day so we can watch this whole thing. So it's hard for me to pick a best one of them all because there's something in all of them that is incredible. And hindsight being 2020 in this situation, knowing that Peter Jackson is going to take it all home for Return of the King, I'm okay with him not getting it for this one. Like I said, I love Gosford Park. I love Ridley Scott. You know, if I was going to give Ridley Scott an Oscar, it would be for either Alien or Blade Runner, not for Black Hawk Down. If Robert Altman was going to get an Oscar for anything, it was going to be for The Player, not for Gosford Park, as much as I like it. Gosford Park is a comedy, so that's going to be a tough sell in the first place. there are a lot of neat things about Moulin Rouge, and there are a lot of neat things about Baz Luhrmann. But the neat things about Baz Luhrmann usually come down to cinematography and art direction, set direction, costume design, visual, everything, but not necessarily the content always. In the Bedroom, I think, is one of those, like Charles said. I mean, it's a perfectly fine movie. It's just kind of it has really good people doing really good performances. But is it memorable and is it a tour de force when a piece of cinema? No, I don't necessarily think so. So I would have definitely put Mulholland Drive in this category. And I think the real contenders would have been, A Beautiful Mind, of course, because Rachel's not wrong. The Academy loves not just biopics, but period pieces. And this is a historical biopic. It's a tearjerker. It's, everything that Townsend says is Oscar bait, um Fellowship of the Ring and this I think would have been the contenders. I would have given it to this because, like I said, I think this is his best movie. I think there's so much going on here, and there's more to come with Lord of the Rings. Even at the time, I mean, the Academy knew, okay, something amazing is happening here with filmmaking in general, but there's so much more to come. And like I said, I wish there was a way to give an Oscar to a trilogy, to give sort of an achievement in filmmaking in that sense. I also wish there were a way to give an Oscar for best song previously recorded, but best use of a previously recorded piece of music in a movie, because Rebecca Del Rio's version of Crying would have won it for me. That's one of the most beautiful. It's the greatest cover of a song in the history of song covers. I would have, if there was an Oscar for that, I would have given it. I would not take Randy Newman out. I would take Sorcerer's Stone out. Because, we have John Williams' 2 scores this year. And again, some of this is hindsight being 20 and hindsight being 2020 and fuck you, J.K. Rowling. But out of the 2 John Williams scores that year, again, there's more to come with Sorcerer's Stone on that variation of the theme. And I think AI is a little bit more of a departure for him. So if we were going to give it to John Williams, which I feel like is a rule, if John Williams does a score, you've got to give him an Oscar nomination. I would have definitely given Angela Badalamenti the Sorcerer's Stone spot. And yes, of course, I don't, did I say I would give it to David Lynch? But yeah, I would give director to David Lynch. Absolutely 100% I'm giving best actress to Naomi Watts. Halle Berry, yes, historic Oscar. Is this Halle Berry's best movie? Not necessarily. But she was very, very good. Same thing. Judi Dench, Nicole Kidman, Sissy Spacek, Renee Zellweger. Are these their best movies? Are these their best performances? Are these their best movies? Not necessarily. They're good. I still never quite understood why Bridget Jones is not played by a British girl, but whatever. It's not my place. Renee Zellweger. If we're going to give Renee Zellweger an Oscar, let's talk about Chicago. Let's not talk about Bridget Jones' Diary. I would have definitely put Naomi Watts over Renee Zellweger in this, and I would have absolutely given it to her. As much as I kind of want to pull a Gloria Stewart and give a Best Supporting Actress nod to Ann Miller, I'm not going to take away an Oscar from Jennifer Connelly. And I'm not going to take a nomination away from Helen Mirren, Maggie Smith, Marissa Tomei, or Kate Winslet. Helen Mirren and Kate Winslet are like my favorite actresses. I'm not taking these nominations away from them. I would probably take Jon Voight out of supporting actor and maybe throw in Justin Theroux. Just because he is so... If a robot could sell his soul, that was the performance he gave, which is very different. And so I probably would have done that. Absolutely would have given this an original screenplay nod. Probably taking out Monsters Ball. Monsters Ball is fine. It's fine. It's fine. Is it Gosford Park? No. Is it Amelie? No. Is it Memento? Fuck no. It's not even Royal Tenenbaums. I mean, I don't think it's one of these things is not like the other when you compare it to the rest of these movies. So I probably would have taken Monsters Ball out, added this one in. Um, I do think there's some sound going on here with this movie that we probably could have done. But again, we got two war movies, a musical, Lord of the Rings, and Amelie. I feel like this and Amelie are on about the same level of sound, of best sound. So that's a toss up. That could go either way. Um, Cinematography, same thing, could go either way. Um, Art direction, again, I feel like it's on par with Amelie. Um, I might give it to this over Gosford Park because once again, Gosford Park is more of a straightforward period piece, whereas Moulin Rouge, which is what won it, was a Baz Luhrmann period piece, and that is going to be a visual assault that you want to feel every punch on your face. Um, and finally, for once, we have Harry Potter and we have Lord of the Rings for art direction, where we're doing something where we're not recreating something, we are creating something. We're recreating a book, but we have to do a visual of a book of very beloved books. Harry Potter has become the level of beloved that Lord of the Rings is. So you had to satisfy a hell of a lot of people who had some major expectations, and they did a very, very good job. But kind of like, with every David Lynch project, and Charles has heard me say this before, I always say, I want every single piece of furniture that is in this movie. And I kind of felt the same way about Amelie as well. Like, I adore her apartment, kind of the same way I love Aunt Ruth's apartment. So they're kind of similar to me, but I might take Gosford Park out of that and put Mulholland Drive in. Um, Editing, just with transitions in this movie, I might put it over um Lord of the Rings. I might put it over Lord of the Rings just because, Black Hawk Down again is very tensely done with quick cuts and everything. Beautiful Mind, you got to do some really good editing work to have Paul Bettany in that movie in the first place. Same thing with Memento, and Moulin Rouge has that Baz Luhrmann fast back and forth thing going on. So, but yeah, I would give this a lot. Like I said, I really love this movie. I think it is David Lynch's masterpiece. I think it is the best performance Naomi Watts has ever given, and she's always good. I've loved Naomi Watts as Tank Girl, so that's saying a lot for me of what she. If Beatrice Straight can win an Oscar for the 3 minutes she has her breakdown in Network, then Naomi Watts can win an Oscar for the scene she does with Chad Everett, and we'll just crop him out of it. That'd be great.
We'll definitely crop him out of it for sure. I mean, as for whether David should have won the award he was nominated for, yes, I think he absolutely had a legitimate claim to it. In fact, I'd argue that his nomination is one of the most interesting directing nominations of that era, because Mulholland Drive represents almost the exact opposite philosophy of filmmaking compared to A Beautiful Mind. Because as we know, A Beautiful Mind is a very traditional prestige picture. Its direction is polished and emotionally accessible and carefully structured around a protagonist whose reality is gradually revealed to be unreliable. The Academy could recognize, I think, what Ron Howard was doing immediately. And there was a clear narrative and a conventional dramatic arc and a reassuring sense the film ultimately resolves itself. Mulholland Drive asks much more from the viewer. I think David deliberately refused to explain the rules of his world, because he created a film in which dreams and memories and fantasies and guilt and reality bled into one another. And he made the audience experience that confusion rather than simply observe it. And that is extraordinary directing. What's particularly impressive is how controlled the film actually is beneath its apparent chaos. The shift in tone, the repeated imagery, the casting parallels, the sound design, the lighting, the editing, the performances, and the visual motifs are incredibly deliberate. It feels like a nightmare, but it isn't filmmaking without structure. The structure is psychological rather than conventional. Why it didn't win, I think, because first, the Academy historically has been much more comfortable rewarding films that demonstrate their achievement openly. David's accomplishment was almost invisible if you're looking for conventional craftsmanship, because he didn't say, look at this complicated narrative I've constructed. He made you feel disoriented and then left you to figure out why. Secondly, A Beautiful Mind had enormous emotional and awards momentum. It was a major prestige production. Russell Crowe was a huge star, and the story of John Nash offered the Academy something it has traditionally responded well to, an inspirational account of a remarkable real person overcoming extraordinary circumstances. Thirdly, I think Mulholland Drive is deliberately uncomfortable. It's sexually charged, it's surreal, it's disturbing, it's ambiguous, and deeply pessimistic about Hollywood and human desire. The Academy wasn't exactly famous for embracing that sort of thing in its major categories. And then I think there's another important factor. David had already been regarded as an unconventional filmmaker for decades. Because, like you guys were saying, his previous nominations for The Elephant Man and Blue Velvet had established him as an important auteur, but Mulholland Drive was even less accessible. So I think for voters who wanted a straightforward demonstration of directing skill, Ron's film was simply easier to reward. Should it have been nominated elsewhere? Absolutely. The most obvious omission, like you guys were saying, is Best Picture. I think this film is one of those whose absence from the Best Picture lineup looks stranger with hindsight. The film had the critical stature, the artistic ambition, the performances, the technical accomplishment, and the cultural impact to justify a nomination. It didn't need to be everyone's favorite movie, but I think if Best Picture is supposed to recognize the year's most significant filmmaking achievements, it belonged in that conversation. The frustrating part is that the Academy clearly recognized something extraordinary in it because David himself was nominated for Best Director. It's strange to effectively say, this director did one of the year's 5 best directing jobs, but the film he directed isn't one of the year's best pictures, which is weird. I totally agree with you guys for saying Naomi Watts should have been nominated. This is probably the acting omission that bothers me the most, because she gave an astonishing performance, because she has to play 2 radically different versions of essentially the same person. The transformation from the radiant, optimistic Betty to the devastated Diane is enormous. And what I think is remarkable is that the performance isn't dependent on a conventional monologue announcing the character's inner turmoil. Naomi communicates the change physically and vocally and psychologically and emotionally, and her audition scene alone is enough to demonstrate what she's capable of. But the later scenes make the performance something much more complicated. I definitely would nominate for Best Actress. Honestly, I think this is one of those performances that has become more respected with time. At the time, I think voters could have looked at Betty and Diane as confusing rather than recognizing how extraordinarily difficult that dual performance actually was. I think Laura Harring deserved consideration too. I'd be slightly less emphatic about an actual nomination for Laura, but I absolutely think she deserved to be in the conversation because the performance is intentionally elusive. Rita is vulnerable, she's mysterious, she's seductive, and she's frightened and almost dreamlike, while Camilla occupies a completely different emotional space. I think Laura has to allow the audience to project onto her without giving away too much. And that's a difficult kind of acting because restraint can easily be mistaken for doing less. As Zan was saying, Best Original Screenplay, this one is complicated because the screenplay is one of the film's greatest achievements, but I understand why it wasn't an obvious Academy screenplay choice. Because the film isn't constructed like a conventional screenplay. It's closer to a cinematic puzzle or a psychological poem. Still, I think it deserved a nomination because the screenplay's construction is remarkably sophisticated. The repeated names, the objects, the locations, the relationships, and the narrative fragments aren't random. The film plants information that only becomes meaningful after the apparent reality collapses, and the dialogue can move from banal to terrifying without warning. And that, my friends, is writing. Also, cinematography. Yes, Peter Deming's cinematography is essential to the film's effect. The contrast between the luminous fantasy world and the darker, more oppressive reality is part of the storytelling itself. The film constantly makes Los Angeles look simultaneously beautiful and sinister. That's not just pretty photography, it's narrative. And I think a Best Cinematography nomination would have been entirely justified. Also, editing. This is perhaps the category I'm most reluctant to criticize the Academy for overlooking, because Mulholland Drive was unusual in how its final structure came together, but retrospectively, the editing deserves enormous credit. The film's transitions between seemingly disconnected pieces create the sensation of discovering a dream rather than watching a conventional narrative. The cut from one reality to another often feels intuitive rather than explanatory. I'd have considered it nomination worthy for sure. Also, original score and sound. Definitely worth considering, because Angelo's score is fundamental to the movie's atmosphere, but the film's sound design is arguably even more important. And I think David understood that sound can create dread before the image does. We see the Club Silencio sequence as a perfect example. The distinction between performance and recorded sound becomes part of the film's philosophical argument. So I think a nomination for Best Original Score would have made sense, although the category was particularly competitive. And here's the bigger issue. The Academy didn't necessarily fail to recognize this film because it wasn't good enough. It failed to recognize it on its own terms. I think David made a film that doesn't behave like an awards movie. It doesn't tell you what to feel. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't offer a reassuring moral. It doesn't even give you stable identities to hold on to. It asks you to participate. And I think that's what's precisely its problem with mainstream awards voters. Because A Beautiful Mind says, here's an extraordinary life story. Let me show you what happens. Mulholland Drive says, here is a dream. Figure out what it means after you wake up. And the Academy, of course, chose the former. So I probably would have chosen David, not because A Beautiful Mind wasn't deserving, but because Mulholland Drive feels like the more singular achievement. 25 years later, we are still arguing about what it means, analyzing its structure, discussing its imagery, and discovering new connections. And that's usually a pretty good sign that a film did something extraordinary. And ironically, I think the Academy's failure to embrace it may have become part of its legacy. It didn't need the Oscar to become one of the defining films of the early 21st century. Its reputation has only grown. This is a masterpiece, and Oscars, I don't understand what you were doing. Anyways, let's get to ratings then. Zan, what do you give Mulholland Drive out of 10?
It's a 10 out of 10. It's my favorite director's best movie. It's everything you want in a David Lynch movie. And like every David Lynch movie, it's everything you had no idea you wanted.
Very well said. Rachel, what do you give this one?
Don't hate me. This is very good. Like I said, I'd seen it before. My only other Lynch experience is Elephant Man, which I love. Obviously John Hurt's performance has a lot to do with that. But it's like on a logical level, I get it. I could see why this is enjoyed and lauded by so many people. I mean, it's exceptional storytelling in a way that you do not see a lot from Hollywood in general. It's not my cup of tea, but I also recognize that that's kind of the case of cinema. It's not everything's going to be everybody's cup of tea. So, but I mean, I am giving this an 8, because it is very, very good. It's just not my jam necessarily. I still need to give Twin Peaks a go though. So, maybe once I experience more David Lynch, maybe my opinion might change.
As a recent Twin Peaks convertee, Rachel, definitely take that trip to Twin Peaks because I think it will change your life. It certainly changed mine. And speaking of someone who has been to Ghostwood Forest multiple times, Charles, what do you give this one out of 10?
Well, as listeners to Ghostwood the Twin Peaks podcast could probably attest, I'm in sync with Zan on this one. I think that this is a fabulous movie. I'm going to give it 10 out of 10 jump scare bums behind Winkies because it's a phenomenal work by David Lynch. It's something that, again, as to your point, Nick, I think is here we are discussing it 25 years later, and we'll be discussing it in the next 25 years because it's that good. So, and obviously we've spent so much time talking about it. There's a lot to discuss here. So in that, I think David Lynch created this spectacular achievement, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to talk about it.
We're so glad you brought it to the Gold Standard Theatre, Charles, and I am with you and Zan. I'm giving this a 10 out of 10. Not because I think it's a flawless or universally accessible film, because it absolutely isn't. It's strange, it's deliberately frustrating, it's opaque, and at times almost hostile to anyone looking for a conventional narrative. But as a piece of filmmaking, it's extraordinary. Because David created this hypnotic psychological world where dreams and memories and desire and guilt and reality constantly bleed into one another. And somehow all of that confusion feels incredibly controlled. The direction is exceptional. The performances are phenomenal, especially Naomi. The cinematography makes Los Angeles look beautiful and deeply sinister at the same time. And the music and the sound design are so integral to the experience that you almost feel them rather than simply hear them. Even the fragmented screenplay becomes more impressive the more you think about it, because the seemingly random details and the repetitions and the names and the objects and locations begin to feel carefully connected. And for me, the real strength is the atmosphere. The film can be romantic and funny and erotic and terrifying and melancholic and completely surreal within minutes, sometimes within seconds. It's also one of those rare movies that becomes richer on a second viewing, as we were saying, because once you have some idea of what's happening underneath the surface, details that seem meaningless suddenly take on an entirely different emotional weight. And I understand why some people find it maddening, though. It doesn't explain itself, it doesn't give you a neat solution, and it doesn't tell you exactly what you're supposed to feel. But personally, that's part of why I love it. This movie isn't really asking to be solved as much as experienced and interpreted, as we were talking about. So for me, it's simply a 10 out of 10. Not necessarily because it's the easiest film to love, but because it's one of those rare films where the way it makes you feel, the way it confuses you, and even the things you can't completely explain become part of the experience itself. Once again, David Lynch, wherever you are, thank you for giving us this movie. So getting to Gold Standard feedback this week, we have quite a bit, starting with Dave Proctor, who gives his thoughts on this one. So Zan, what does Dave have for us this time?
Dave says, hello, cinephiles. I'm going to jump right to the point. It's Fight Club. Not really, but if it were a genre, it would be one. I am not the David Lynch fan you are, at least some of you. I am not saying he isn't great, I just missed the boat. I didn't watch Twin Peaks, and I just didn't know who he was except through the collected podcasters, some of who are in this group, brought him out. I have a big backlog of things to watch and things to listen to, and I will complete that list right after I finish the internet. I didn't know what to expect. It was a feeling that grew throughout, and at the end, I knew that if I watched it 10 more times, I still wouldn't get it. This doesn't make it bad, but what it does is become a project. I'm intrigued. I love movies that can surprise me. This one certainly did. When I rate movies, I am torn. I want to do 2 ratings, one for artistic or historic value, like Selma or Schindler's List, and I guess Fantastic Planet now. Another rating for rewatchability, like Airplane, Tombstone, Star Trek, Doctor Who, etc. I know those are not all movies, but you get it. Some items get watched thousands of times, and according to critics, suck absolutely. I would like to agree with Dave on that one, and say, look, I said I liked it. I didn't say it was good. 2 different things. Other things that are critically acclaimed and true art are really hard to watch but live in your heart. I am not sure of this one yet. It will be rewatched. I may have to get back to you in a few years after the 10th rewatch. Thanks for hearing my non-opinion, David K. Proctor. Well, Dave, I would like to say to you, we will see you again in 25 years.
Very well played indeed, Zan. And moving on, we actually have some feedback from Aaron Case, who writes in, and his subject is, did you want to tell me something, Zan? So Aaron writes in, hello, Gold Standard hosts and Charles. Hey, Aaron. When I heard that you would all be discussing Mulholland Drive, I immediately thought to myself, about damn time. What took so long? I honestly thought this would have been one of Zan's first choices when the podcast shifted to chosen movies. But I'm not disappointed because this episode serves as a legacy sequel to a certain Ghostwood podcast. I think what I love most about this movie is the fact that every single time I watch it, my mind is always searching not for the meaning, but for a new theory. While I ultimately tend to fall into the camp that the first half is a dream and the second half is reality, I also find it fun to look at other possibilities. My two favorite alternate fun theories are this. One, everything in the first half regarding Betty is indeed a dream, but any scene in the first half in which she doesn't appear is set in the reality of the second half. Two, the first half is a reality, while the second half is Betty asleep, having a nightmare about her fears of how her relationship with Rita will end. As for the definitive meaning, I have a question for all of you. Lynch once wrote out a list of details for audiences to follow in order to best understand the story and meaning of the movie. I once watched the movie 2 times back to back while focusing on the list, and I arrived at a very conclusive conclusion. Lynch wrote this list just to fuck with people. I am convinced that he just got tired of being asked what the movie means and just jotted down a bunch of random sentences to send people on a wild goose chase. My question for you is this. Do any of you believe that the list has any real meaning? Take care, Erin. Well, I guess, Charles, starting with you being the bringer of today's movie, do you think that the list that David gave us had any real meaning?
I think some of it, but I think for the most part, I think Aaron is spot on. I think this list, which I have in front of me, is something that I think, exactly to his point, I think it's something that Lynch came up with because he was tired of fielding questions about the movie. And there are certain things like, in this list, like notice appearances of the red lampshade. Okay. What does that have to do with the price of eggs? So yeah, I think this list is, for the most part, full of it. And Aaron just made me smile mentioning that.
I love that. Rachel, Zan, did you have any thoughts on Aaron's question?
I'm sorry, Aaron. I'm not laughing necessarily at your question because I think it's a very, it's a valid question, especially, as a newbie, but it's like, no, because that would not be the first and last time that an artist has done something like that. John Lennon famously wrote I Am the Walrus just to fuck with people because he was sick and tired of people asking about the meanings behind some of the songs the Beatles wrote and released. And eventually he was like, he got, obviously the inspiration comes from Alice in Wonderland, but still he wrote it in a way where it's just kind of this nonsense string of phrases and words and because he knew people would be like, what does it mean? And he'd be like, it doesn't mean jack shit. I wrote it to fuck with y'all. So him and Lynch, not the first artist to do that and not the last.
Zan, do you agree with Rachel and Charles's sentiment?
I absolutely do. This list is full of shit. And the reason I know that is because, first of all, David Lynch never tells you what his movies are in a linear fashion. I actually did take David Lynch's masterclass. I signed up for masterclass and listened to David Lynch's masterclass. And that's why I keep saying David Lynch is all about ideas, because that's what his masterclass was all about, was ideas. And these are just ideas put together. That's how David Lynch makes movies. Also, this reads like a book discussion group guide for your basic book discussion group at a library or something. It's very facile. And one of them is an accident is a terrible event. It's a terrible event. Notice the location of the accident. The accident is fucking Mulholland Drive. That's the title. He is fucking with you. Absolutely, he's fucking with you. And it feels like, notice appearances of the red lampshade. Yeah, and the red lipstick and the red curtains and all the other red shit you've put in every fucking movie you've ever done. Pay particular attention to the beginning of the film. At least 2 clues are revealed before the credits. Okay, sure. Whatever. You know? Who gives a key and why? Well, first of all, one of those keys, we don't know who gave it. It just is found in the damn purse, okay? And also, where is Aunt Ruth? Working, and then at the end of it, she's in her fucking apartment. We know where Aunt Ruth is. So, yeah, this list is so full of it, and I think it's just it's that point in The Office where Creed starts getting up to a bunch of crap and Pam says, "Corporate needs you to find the differences between these 2 pictures." And then she looks at the camera and says, "It's the same picture." That's how this feels. There's an old Emo Phillips joke that reminds me of this as well, where he goes to a psychiatrist and the psychiatrist shows him an ink blot and says, "What does this say to you?" He says, "Well, it just looks to me like a standard number 3 in the Rorschach series to test obsessive compulsiveness." And then the doctor got really sad looking, and I said, "Okay, it's a butterfly." That's what this feels like. It feels like, okay, fine, it's a butterfly. Here's you want symbolism, go find it. And that's why I say about watching David Lynch, stop trying to figure it out. Stop trying to figure him out. Stop trying to look for linear stuff. Start thinking, this is a man who had some ideas and put them together and made a movie, and now you get to enjoy it. You get to experience it. You get to enjoy it. End of story. So, yes, I 100% agree. This list is full of shit.
And I'm going to, I guess, conclude that with saying I totally agree with the 3 of you indeed, and of course with Aaron. So, of course, dear listeners, if you want to be like the wonderful Dave Proctor and Aaron Case and share your thoughts on the films we discuss here, you can do so by shooting an email to goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Once again, goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Feel free to follow us on our social media. If you're not doing so already, you can find us on Twitter or X as Oscars Gold, Facebook as Gold Standard the Oscars Podcast, and also Blue Sky, where we're also at Oscars Gold. We love hearing from you guys, and we appreciate the follow and the support. Also, regardless of the platform you're listening to us on, be sure, of course, to rate and review us, as that keeps the algorithm stimulated and allows the show to reach more like-minded ears like yours. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your neighbors. We don't care. Just spread the good word. Big thank you to those who have done so. Future thank you to those who will. Also, if you'd like to hear us discuss your favorite movies, you can join up a wonderful family of patrons on Patreon and check out what we're going on there. You also get to unlock our previous reviews of such films as recently selected by our patrons like Godzilla -1, The Shawshank Redemption, Finding Neverland, Prey, and many more. So join our Golden Army, head on over to patreon.com/goldstandardoscars, and a big thank you to our wonderful patrons for their support. Speaking of which, this month, of course, our patrons have selected The Color Purple plus the review, and that will be coming to you shortly. So I guess we'll see what happens to that. So, Rachel, when you're not here discussing supernatural things that happen in Hollywood, where can folks find you on the interwebs?
Well, you can usually find me with the Five-ish Fangirls podcast, or a mostly weekly pop culture nerd podcast. We talk about all sorts of geeky and nerdy topics from the female perspective, because fangirls are real fans too. We can be found pretty much wherever you find podcasts, and at the Fangirls.com, where you can connect with all of our podcast related social media accounts and our individual ones as well.
Awesome stuff. And Zan, where can folks find you?
You can find me hanging out with Charles on our podcast Drunk Cinema, where we watch our favorite movies over our favorite adult beverages, discuss those movies, and record that discussion for your entertainment. Our most recent episode that's out there is us finally getting to do Raising Arizona. Our upcoming episode that you should be looking forward to soon is our 100th episode, where we go back to our Batman roots with The Dark Knight. And our next episode, we will be celebrating the 60th anniversary of Star Trek with Star Trek 6, because once again, we go back to our Batman roots. And yeah, six is good. So you can find that wherever podcasts are found. If you're looking for me on social media, I would love it if you did. You can find me. Your best bets would be Instagram, Letterboxd, and TikTok. I am also on Substack and Film Reality. I just started there, and I'm on Tumblr. And I'm just trying to broaden my horizons. Just more places to find cat videos is what I'm really looking for. But on all of those, my handle is Udanax19.
Awesome stuff. I'm actually wearing a cat t-shirt at this point, but folks in voice podcast land can't see it. But yes, folks, definitely be sure to check out everything Zan has going on. And what about you, Charles?
Well, Nick, of course, you can find me at Charles Skaggs on X, Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky. Or you can find me, Charles Skaggs in Hilliard, Ohio, on Facebook. And, of course, my blog of geeky things, Damn Good Coffee and Hot, where I talk about all the stuff that we, generally talk about on our podcasts or here on Gold Standard. Also, news, and it features comic book news, comic book TV news that, recently I just wrote a story for DC Comics that was officially announced here a couple of weeks ago and will be coming out on November 28th. It's called, I can't talk about the story, but the anthology that it's going to be in is called DC's Naughty List. And it features some wonderful art by Laura Braga, Italian artist Laura Braga. So, someone that Nick can appreciate for sure. And then, so stay tuned for that. And then also news of my other podcast on Damn Good Coffee. Zan mentioned Drunk Cinema, so I don't need to mention that. But the Phantom Zone podcast that I do with a certain DJ Nik fellow you may have heard of, where right now we're going through Lanterns, the HBO Max series based off of DC Comics Green Lantern characters. Having a lot of fun with that. Jesse joined us for our first episode of that. And hopefully, I guess, he is going to be writing in because I read the email. So for episode 2, so stay tuned for that because Nick and I are going to be talking about that in a couple of days. So that'll be coming soon. And hey, if anybody enjoyed Zan and I talking about David Lynch and Mulholland Drive, or if you enjoy Twin Peaks or what have you, check out Ghost with the Twin Peaks podcast, which is still available, even though we're not doing it at the moment. So I think you enjoyed it. We did a couple of episodes devoted to Mulholland Drive back about 6 years ago. So kind of dating us on that, but six is good. And that's what I've got going on.
Awesome stuff indeed, Charles. And I definitely look forward to discussing more Lanterns with you indeed. When it comes to myself, folks, granted there's no country music in this one. Well, there's a cowboy. But if you are fans of that country music, of course, you can find myself at my day job hosting the radio show Whiskey and Cigarettes, where we play the very best and nothing but the best of country music for y'all from Alabama to Bailey Zimmerman. And for more information about that, you can visit our website, which is whiskeyandcigarettesshow.com. We will, of course, be tributing the late, great Dolly Parton this coming Sunday as of this recording because, hey, Dolly was an icon, a legend, and a wonderful person. I never had the pleasure of meeting her, but, of course, she definitely deserves the homage. Podcast-wise, if you are fans of those superhero movies, you can find myself and Keith Bliss on Happiness in Darkness, the superhero movie podcast, where, of course, we discuss any every superhero movie under the sun and anything tangentially heroic. We recently reviewed Kung Fu Panda 4, and coming up next, we are going to be reviewing, speaking of Batman, the animated version of Batman Nightfall Part 1, which I'm very excited about because I was a huge fan of the story arc comic book-wise, so I guess hopefully they will do justice to that. And of course, as Charles mentioned, looking forward to talking more Lanterns on the Fandom Zone. And speaking of this to come on this show, and next time as our wait for the 99th Best Picture to reveal itself continues, we will be reviewing a movie that Rachel selected, and we'll be staying in 2001 once again with the Robert Lukatic film, Legally Blonde. So first off, Charles, thanks so much for joining us on behalf of myself, Zan and Rachel. It was a joy having you with us, and we certainly look forward to having you back with us again with more of your movie selections.
Well, thank you, Nick. I had a ball once again. I love hanging with three of my favorite people and getting to talk a David Lynch film. Well, it just makes me all warm and fuzzy inside. So thanks again for the opportunity to come on here and share my thoughts, and have a great night talking with all of you.
Certainly a pleasure, of course. So, Rachel and Zan, anything else you would like to add on our upcoming movie or anything else before we sign off?
What, like it's hard?
Make sure you wear pink, because orange is definitely not the new pink.
And do you know she's my age? Yeah, don't get your perm wet, kids. That's, you will ruin your perm.
First rule of hair care maintenance.
First rule of hair care maintenance.
I very much look forward to discussing this one because, of course, we did allude to it during My Cousin Vinny, so I'm glad it's finally here. So, of course, dear listeners, thanks as always for showing supporting us. We'll see you next time with Legally Blonde and on Patreon with The Color Purple. Until then, of course, big thank you to Charles once again for joining us. Enjoy those movies. Keep that popcorn hot. Big thank you to Dave and Erin for writing in. And all around thank you to you all so much for the privilege of your time. Ciao. Bye.